car ton bras s'est porté épée, il s'est porté la croix. Ton histoire est une épopée des plus brillants exploits. God keep our land glorious and free. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Let the doors be open. Que l'on ouvre les portes. Merci. Statements by members, déclaration de députés. The honourable member from Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, every winter, Kelsey Aid Canada has its winter drive in memory of Mata Gudri. She and the younger sons, or Chote Sahibzade of the 10th Sikh Guru, Guru Gobind Singh, were made to suffer the elements during winter while in captivity. In Canada, inflation and food insecurity disproportionately impact women and acutely impact our youth. And 1 in 3 food bank users are children. This year in Victoria, Kelsey Aid Canada provided food to Rainbow Kitchen, Mustard Seed, UVic and Royal Roads University food banks, hot meals at Our Place Shelter, tents and winter items for Justice Van Society and peer-to-peer, as well as continuing to support their annual donations to youth-focused organizations like Threshold Housing, Out of the Range Shelter, and the Foundry Clinic. Women and children, especially single-parent families, are struggling with the high cost of living. I thank Kelsey Aid Canada for all they do.
The honourable member from Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston.
'Tis a week before Christmas, and it's time to state that our PM is well past his best before date. After 8 years of his rule, it's time to say thanks for doubling the number of folks using food banks. After 8 years, when our kids nestle snug in their beds, they're just lucky there's still a roof over their heads. For on cold winter nights, under snow and the stars, many citizens now have to sleep in their cars. You can protest, of course, but only in small amounts, lest like the truckers, he freezes your bank accounts. And he'll accuse you of hate based on faith or on race, which seems strange for a man caught 3 times wearing blackface. He's so quick to say sorry for wrongs from long ago, but not for when he elbowed Ruth Ellen Brousseau. So let's quote back to the PM some words of his home. Sir, enough is enough. Now go home and stay home. And here's what we'd like Santa's elves to administer. This Christmas, please bring us a brand new Prime Minister.
The honourable member from Willowdale.
Mr. Speaker, 2023 marks the 60th anniversary of Canada's diplomatic relations with the Republic of Korea. Several days ago, the Korean National Assembly adopted a special resolution celebrating this significant milestone. The resolution mentioned the immense contributions of Canadian veterans to the defense of democracy during the Korean War and acknowledged the deep economic, strategic, and cultural ties that bind our 2 nations together. As such, Mr. Speaker, I rise to echo the same sentiments in this House. Today and every day, let us honor our shared history with this cherished ally and redouble our efforts to broaden and deepen our comprehensive partnership while celebrating the enduring friendship that has flourished between our 2 nations. As they say in Korean, ham ke do, gun ha ke, stronger together. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député d'Abitibi.
The honourable member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to welcome 3 local farmers to the Hill, Eric Lafontaine, Alexandre Bégin, and Mathieu Dumont. I salute the courage of all agricultural entrepreneurs who've lived through one of the worst years in terms of weather. In Abitibi West, they experienced a winter frost that destroyed crops, historic forest fires that forced the evacuation of livestock, and catastrophic drought. To make the public and elected officials more aware of the economic and psychological psychological impacts, Eric, Alexandre, and Mathieu and Maxime Fontaine have drafted a red letter, which they will deliver today to the Minister of Agriculture. The letter was signed by 79 farm businesses in my riding, many of which are currently having to sell part of their livestock due to risk management programs that are too poorly adapted to climate change. We're talking about nearly 30% of the livestock that has already been sold or is currently being sold to ensure these farms' survival. Minister, you need to be generous and commit now to ensuring the sustainability of our agriculture. Mr. Speaker, I take the floor today to express my sincere gratitude to the dedicated individuals and organizations that support the Vaudreuil-Soulanges food banks for their outstanding service to our community, especially during this holiday season. The holidays, a time of joy and celebration for many, can also be a challenging time for those experiencing economic hardship. It's during these times that the Vaudreuil-Soulanges food banks rise to the challenge. To the team at L'Actuel, La Source d'Entraide, Popote Roulante, Café de la Débrouille, and Moisson Sud-Ouest, I say thank you.
Teams and volunteers at Le Pont Bridging, Meals on Wheels, and the Dream Center, I express my sincere gratitude to you on behalf of all members of our community for your tireless work in extending a helping hand to those in need. Because of you, the holidays will be a little brighter for our neighbors, family, and friends, and for that, and on behalf of this entire House, I say thank you.
The Honourable Member from Essex.
Speakers, families across Canada anxiously anticipate Christmas Day, opening presents and having turkey. Many families will not all be together. Doctors, nurses, and caregivers in our hospitals, long-term care homes, and hospice will be taking care of our loved ones. Firefighters, police officers, and first responders will be keeping our streets safe. Hydro workers will be working to keep the lights on our Christmas trees bright. Snowplow operators will work day and night to keep our roads clear and safe. Pilots, flight attendants, and airport personnel will be working hard to get us to our destination so we can be with our families. Border security officers will work long shifts protecting our vast borders. And of course, our brave men and women in uniform both in Canada and around the globe keeping Canadians safe will sacrifice yet another Christmas without their family. And the list goes on. This Christmas, I ask Canadians to take a moment to thank those who serve so selflessly. Thank you to those who will miss their Christmas Day so that we can be at ours. Merry Christmas.
The Honourable Member from Mount Royal.
The increase in anti-Jewish hate over the last 2 months is a danger to our country and its values. It is a danger to our democracy. It is a danger to our national security. One of the most hostile places for Jews is on campus. Last week, a U.S. House committee heard from the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and Penn. All three were asked whether a call for the genocide of Jews would violate their code of conduct. None unambiguously said yes. Today, some colleagues and I sent a letter to the 25 biggest Canadian universities asking how they are protecting their Jewish students. One thing we asked was whether a call for the genocide of Jews would violate their policies. I have also tabled a motion with the Justice Committee for us to undertake a study on anti-Semitism with a focus on universities. I hope colleagues will join me in quickly wanting to tackle this issue. Mr. Speaker, the Jewish community cannot fight this alone. We need all MPs and all Canadians on our side. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Mississauga, Erin Mills.
Mr. Speaker, as we look to the new year, I rise in the House today to wish all the residents of my community of Mississauga, Erin Mills, and all Canadians a very happy holiday season. This is a time to reflect upon and reinforce Canadian values of hope, generosity, and unity for everyone, especially during what can be a very difficult time in many of our communities. I also want to thank my own team who work diligently to support the residents of our riding and the work that I do on their behalf. We have worked hard this year for Canadians, Mr. Speaker, and I know that we will continue to work harder for them in the new year. On behalf of all the residents of my riding, I want to wish you all a very Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and all the very best in the new year. Thank you.
The Honourable Member from Banff-Airdrie.
80 years ago today, the village of Kalvarita in Greece fell victim to the cruelty of occupying German Nazi forces in World War II. On December 13th of 1943, the Nazis rounded up all the males over the age of 12 for execution, and they locked the women and children in the village's school and lit it on fire to burn them alive. The women broke down the doors to find their husbands and sons sadly dead, and their village in ashes. The widows were left to rebuild shattered lives. They displayed immense courage and determination as they worked to provide for their families and preserve their community. The women of Calvarita demonstrated the power of human spirit in adversity and testified to the indomitable strength of women. Euphemia Vea was the last widow of the massacre. She passed away in 2008 after having immigrated here to Canada with her daughter, Georgia. And her courage and resilience allowed her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren to thrive as proud Canadians. As we reflect on this dark chapter in history, let us honor their memory, and may the victims of the massacre of Calvarita rest in peace.
Wow. L'honorable député de Sherbrooke.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to support the Remove Your Label campaign of the Fondation du Centre de Jeunesse de l'Estrie. This initiative is designed to raise public awareness of the importance of removing the labels we put on others, particularly those under the care of youth protection, young offenders, and young youth protection workers. Our young people need to have confidence in themselves to achieve their goals, and this is even truer when they've had a difficult start. By proudly wearing this ribbon, I become a goodwill ambassador, and I'd encourage others to do the same. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence in the gallery of the new executive director of the Fondation du CGE, Alexandra Goulet, and congratulate her on this initiative. She herself benefited from youth protection services and is well placed to understand the importance of destigmatizing the children under youth protection. Congratulations, Alexandra, and long live the campaign.
The honourable member from Dufferin-Caledon.
Conservatives support Ukraine. It was a conservative government that was the first Western country in the world to recognize an independent Ukraine. It was a conservative government that negotiated the existing Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. It was a conservative government that commenced Operation Unifier. And it was conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper who said to Vladimir Putin, "Get out of Ukraine." On the other side, this Liberal government exported a gas turbine that's been used to pump Russian gas to fund Putin's war machine. It was this Liberal government that allowed Canadian detonators to end up in Russian mines that are being used by the Russian army in this war. It was this Liberal government that decided to not provide war risk insurance that prevents Canadian companies from investing in Ukraine. Don't listen to their Liberal disinformation. Conservatives unequivocally support Ukraine.
The honourable member from Selkirk-Interlake Eastmain.
The results of Operation Unifier is why Ukraine has been able to fight for the last 658 days against Russia's genocidal war. After Russia annexed Crimea and began the war in Donbass in 2014, the Liberals and NDP on multiple occasions voted against Operation Unifier, voted against Operation Reassurance, voted against the first shipments of military aid to Ukraine, and voted against hundreds of millions of dollars in assistance to Ukraine. And in 2016, this Liberal government's first foreign policy act was to cancel the provision of radar-sat images to Ukraine to appease Russia. Since 2018, Conservatives called on Canada to send lethal defensive aid to Ukraine when it could have acted as a deterrent against Russia. But the NDP Liberal government refused until the hot war began and even called me a warmonger for it in early 2022. Conservatives negotiated the first Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, and when we form government, we'll negotiate a better one that doesn't include a carbon tax. Conservatives will always stand with Ukraine. Slava Ukraini!
The honourable member from Winnipeg North.
Yet they still voted against the Ukraine-Canada trade agreement. Mr. Speaker, we all remember the voting marathon last week. While the Conservative leader was whining and dining last week at a high-end fundraiser, his Conservative MPs here were served a cold, unhappy meal, Mr. Speaker. The Conservative leader may want Canadians only to order from off the value menu, but we know they deserve the whole Big Mac meal, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Canadians have seen the mega politics value menu the Conservative leader has to offer, and they are not loving it, Mr. Speaker. But let us be serious. Mr. Speaker, Canadians know it would be a McNight
We've now had our tit for tat. I would like to hear the honourable member from Vancouver Kingsway, please. The honourable member from Vancouver Kingsway.
Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the nation, Liberal numbers were tanking to the PM's frustration. The Speaker was restless with nightmares in bed, while partisan videos danced through his head. As secular snowflakes made their Grinch-like descent, the Bloc says that Christmas is not a religious event. While the two Greens tried hard to make themselves heard, if co-leaders don't work, maybe try a third. When what to my wondering eyes should appear, the Conservative leader bringing burgers, no beer, with his little red apple who votes through the nights. I knew in a moment this guy really bites. More rapid than reindeer, his chops he laid bare, revealing his taxpayer-funded oral health care. Public dental for all is the NDP's dream. We'd have pharmacare too if the grits weren't so mean. And one final wish for this season of light, happy holidays to all, and to all a good bite.
I love a good roast. L'honorable député Abitibi-Témiscamingue.
The honourable member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Oh.
Hastings, excusez-moi. Oh, Montarville. L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Montarville. My apologies. Acadian Remembrance Day reminds us that in December of 1758, 3 ships packed with Acadian deportees were shipwrecked, killing 850 of them. It was the deadliest episode of what has been called the Great Upheaval, which resulted in the dispersal of the Acadian population across North America. In the grand scheme of history, Acadian identity was, not so long ago, unacceptable to English colonialists. They did everything in their power to marginalize and even assimilate them, but it didn't work. The Acadian identity survived and bounced back into a dynamic diaspora that continues to thrive. But the trauma of those who survived those deportations, lost at sea, victims of a heinous attempt at eradication that cannot be denied, will always be a painful wound. Today, Acadia remembers, and so does Quebec.
The honourable member from Hastings, Lennox, Nottington.
After 8 years of this Liberal NDP government, Canadians are financially spent. Instead of common sense tax cuts to help struggling families, in his fall economic statement, the Prime Minister doubled down on his massive increase to the carbon tax, driving up the cost of groceries, heating, and gas. When the wallets of Canadian families were raided bare by this government's carbon tax, it was the Conservatives that heard the calls for help. It was the Conservatives that introduced C234 to deliver carbon relief on farmers and the people they feed.
That's right.
The legislation was duly passed in this House, Mr. Speaker, with support of every party except the government. And then, right before Christmas, the Prime Minister called in favors from his functionaries in the other place and lobbied his Liberal-appointed and anointed senators to cut the legislation. Now that it's back in the House, the Prime Minister needs to put his zeal for carbon tax aside, listen to Canadians who feel troubled, broken, and betrayed this Christmas season, rein in his ideologues in Cabinet, and pass C234.
The honourable member from Dartmouth, Cole Harbour.
'Twas the week before Christmas, and I must admit, 30 hours was a long time to sit. But Liberals prevailed on behalf of the masses, while Tories stepped back and sat on their hands. On the other side, we witness a continuing saga. Diefenbaker's party looks much more like MAGA. And I know they've been challenged by a leader's swinging door, but they think they struck gold with leader number 4. They gave him a makeover with etiquette classes, pumped up his chest, and took off his glasses. But no matter the issue they put on the docket, we still persevere with the dippers in our pocket. This marriage of convenience of support from the Bloc Québécois. But now it's time to return to our ridings and share with our friends the best Christmas tidings. And Mr. Speaker, I know that you will hate to see us go. If you think of us over Christmas, please don't send us a video.
That is really good advice. Oral questions. Questions orales. L'honorable chef de l'opposition.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Mrs. Speaker, after 8 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost of debt for Canadian families. He said that the government was going to burden itself with even more debt so that Canadians don't have to do so themselves. But today we've just learned that now Canadian families spend more on interest on their debts than ever in our history, more than Americans spent during the 2008 crash. Will the Prime Minister finally inverse inflationist policy and taxes that have indebted Canadian families and that force them to give more to bankers and less for the groceries? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader continues to rise to speak about austerity, and we've just seen last week the true face of austerity from the Conservatives. They voted against helping dairy and egg producers and poultry farmers. They voted against funding for the Plains of Abraham. They voted against helping people from the Madeline Islands after Hurricane Fiona. Even worse, the member for Mégantic-l'Érable himself voted against funding for the railway plans for Lac Mégantic. Shame. Quebecers will never forget it.
L'honorable chef de l'opposition.
Another example. The Prime Minister hasn't even started building around Lac Mégantic. It's been 8 years. For 8 years, there have been announcements and announcements and announcements. Money is spent, but with no results. The same is true with regards to affordability. He spent $97 billion for housing affordability, but what it did was double the cost of housing. According to the Bank of Canada, the cost of housing is worse today than over the past 41 years. Will the Prime Minister finally inverse his inflationist policies that have doubled the cost of housing for Canadians? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, whilst the Conservative Party was partying last week, Canadians were served cold chicken McNuggets. $2 million, that was the cost of showing the true face of the Conservative Party of Canada. When it comes to supporting our veterans, how did they vote? Against. When it comes to supporting farmers, how did they vote? Against. When it comes to helping First Nations, how do they vote? Against. Mr. Speaker, we see who they truly are.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
For 8 years, this Prime Minister and NDP Liberal government are not worth the cost. He said that he was taking on all this debt so that Canadians wouldn't have to. Well, now we learn that Canadians are spending more on household debt interest than at any time in Canadian history, more than the American families were during the 2008 financial crisis that almost brought down the global economy. Will the Prime Minister reverse the inflationary high tax policies that have indebted Canadians and driven up their interest rates?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
The audacity of this Conservative leader knows no bounds. Right. Just last week, he voted against a national school food program, and now he rises to talk about affordability. That's right. Let's be clear. This Conservative leader has no long-term vision for this country, with or without glasses. It takes more than a couple of bags of McDonald's to feed Canadians. That's why we're going to continue to step up and be there with investments for Canadians, while he talks about cuts and austerity and then goes and votes for cuts and austerity.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians can't even afford to feed themselves a couple of bags of McDonald's after 8 years of this Prime Minister taxing their food. Speaking of food, you know the only problem with his school food framework? It doesn't fund any food.
Right.
It funds politicians to talk with bureaucrats who talk with lobbyists about establishing a conversation towards consulting. It funds bureaucracy and not families. So speaking of one way he can make food more affordable for everyone, including our kids, will he pass Bill C-234, the common sense conservative bill to take the tax off?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, once again, we've seen exactly why, whatever his justifications, they have chosen to vote against initiatives there to help Canadians. Whether it's dental support for hundreds of thousands of kids that we've already brought in, with more support for seniors, they chose to vote against months ago, Mr. Speaker. They're continuing to step up and vote against the programs that matter. And while they seem not to care about climate change and want to sit back and watch the world burn, they're actually going to watch Canadians' food sources burn as well.
Here, here.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, it is that Prime Minister that is burning a hole in the pockets of Canadians. We voted against his plan to quadruple the carbon tax, a tax on heat, gas, and groceries. Now, the Prime Minister, when I raised the cost of $100,000 for one farm in my riding, which will rise to $400,000, I said, will he call the family and find out and tell them how they're going to pay the tax? He said he would reach out to them. He would have a conversation about how they're going to pay a $400,000 carbon tax bill. Can he tell the House what he told that family about how they're going to come up with $400 grand in more taxes?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
We recognize, Mr. Speaker, that the price on pollution is a key part of actually making things more affordable for the long term for Canadians by pushing and encouraging innovation. Indeed, our departments reached out to that farm family, to that very successful large mushroom farm in the member opposite's riding, to talk about the programs we have that can move off of their dependence on fossil fuels. We know there's work to do. We know there are investments to make, but that, Mr. Speaker, is how we fight climate change and build a better future. We have a plan to fight climate change. They have no plan because they don't even recognize that climate change is real.
Here, here.
Then I have
the Honourable Member for Bailey-Chambly. Yesterday, Canada at the UN voted for a ceasefire in Gaza. I unreservedly commend the wisdom of the Canadian government, who joins a huge international movement. An important nuance has to be noted. This is not telling Israel that it cannot defend itself. It is not a support for Hamas. It is an indignified response to the loss of human life. To promote peace here as well, can the Prime Minister commit to changing our statutes so that hate speech in all of its forms is condemned? Mr. Speaker, the impact of the crisis and the war and the violence in the Middle East can be felt throughout the world, especially in Canada. We are a strong country, strong through its diversity. We have people from all sorts of origins who are currently stressed, scared, and angry. And that is exactly why we're working so hard to fight against anti-Semitism, to fight against Islamophobia. We do everything we can to unite people in these difficult times so that people remember who we are and what our values are as Canadians. The Honourable Member for Bailey-Chambly. My call to the Prime Minister is as follows. Let us end 2023 with dignity. We could unanimously vote for peace in our streets and peace in general if we exclude religious-based hate crime from our society. Our streets will be safer and our conscience would be cleaner and more at peace. Can the Prime Minister commit to this? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I would like to commend and thank the leader of the Bloc Québécois for his approach, for his desire to see a reduction in violence and division in our country. It is a desire that we share, and we will work on this and continue to work on this. We do recognize that this situation is delicate and difficult, especially when it comes to touching freedom of speech and freedom of religion. There is no simplistic solution to this. There is only hard work in order to unite people, and that is exactly what we are doing and what we'll continue to do. The Honourable Member for New Westminster Burnaby. Mr. Speaker, the number of forced evictions reported in Quebec continues to rise at a worrying rate. Where are these people going to live? Over 1 million affordable housing units have been lost because of the Liberals and the Conservatives. And just last week, the Conservatives voted to cut all funding for social and affordable housing. The government says it wants to draw inspiration from wartime measures. Where was the war effort to combat the housing crisis over the past 8 years? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, as we have said, we will use all tools at our disposal to make housing more affordable, and we'll do so with serious. Minister Fraser stated that we would go back to some wartime policy in order to create a catalogue of house designs that will allow us to accelerate the building of houses. This initiative is one of our innovative and bold ideas to modernise and accelerate the building of housing units in our country. This is another example. And the federal government can do this so that all Canadians have a roof over their heads. Before we continue, I would just like to remind the Right Honourable Prime Minister and all members that one must not refer to the surname of a member. We must refer to them by their title or their riding.
For East.
People in Halifax are having to live in fishing tents this winter because of lack of affordable homes. Just last week, the cut-and-gut Conservatives voted no to funding community housing.
Shame.
And the out-of-touch Liberals keep delaying critical funding to build affordable homes. The Housing Minister says he wants to draw inspiration from what Canada did in wartime to fix the housing crisis. A catalogue is not going to cut it. Part of that effort involved a national rent control initiative. Will the Prime Minister bring forward rent control to curb sky-high rent?
Hear, hear. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've shown a consistent willingness and desire to work with the provinces in areas of their jurisdiction in cooperative ways, and we are going to continue to, including on the issue of rent control. But there's not just one way to approach the housing crisis. It's something that we're doing on many fronts. So not just the catalogue, but indeed we're building more apartments and co-ops by removing the GST on construction. We're eliminating barriers to get more homes built faster by working directly with cities. And we're helping Canadians save up for a home with the First Home Savings Account. I know there's more to do, and we're going to continue to work with all governments to take bold action to tackle housing affordability.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Minister didn't answer my question about the Carlton mushroom farms, which faces a $400,000 carbon tax bill when the Prime Minister is done quadrupling the tax. When we spoke about this on November the 29th, he said that he looks forward to hearing the sustainable practices that the farm has put in place. Well, I can tell him I helped the farm actually get natural gas to its in order to power some of its operations, which is a lower emitting form of energy. But they're still going to face a massive tax increase. How will the Prime Minister advise the farm to pay it? By raising prices on Canadians or shutting down production and bringing in more foreign food?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, for farms across this country that are shifting towards natural gas and lower emitting ways of heating and using their various machinery, that is something that we have put in place significant programs to help them with, and that is something we are going to continue to do because it's part of our plan to both fight climate change and build a net zero economy of the future. We have a plan, Mr. Speaker. The Conservative Party of Canada has no plan to fight climate change. Indeed, they think we should be backing off on all the things we're doing and instead of continuing to fight climate change and grow a strong economy.
That's right.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, the Prime Minister is backing off the things he's doing. Ironically, he's the one that brought in a temporary pause because his caucus was revolting regarding home heating oil. But my question was about the Medeiros Carlton mushroom farm. He claims that he's got government programs to help farmers use more natural gas the same time as he's quadrupling the tax on natural gas, which perhaps is the reason why Canada ranks 58th out of 64 when it comes to climate index performance. Mr. Speaker, he doesn't have a climate plan, he has a tax plan, so how will he advise the Maderos farm to pay the $400,000 bill he's sending them?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we recognize that climate change is a reality. We recognize that we need to help families and businesses across this country reduce their emissions and continue to prosper and grow in a world where the cost of inaction on climate change is increasing exponentially. That is why we have put in place programs to support farms, programs to support Canadians, indeed, to get off home heating oil, for example, and transform into heat pumps. These are things that we are doing as part of our plan. The Conservatives have no plan.
That's right.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Our plan is to bring home production back to Canadian farms, Mr. Speaker. His plan raises a carbon tax on a greenhouse in my riding, which meant that their produce is more expensive in the village of Manotick than a Mexican tomato is in the village of Manotick, sending a price signal for consumers to buy the tomato that had to be transported by truck and train, burning fossil fuels right across the continent. Why doesn't he axe the tax so that we can bring down the cost of farm production and bring home more clean, green Canadian produce?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the price on pollution is simple. Activities that cause pollution cost a bit more, but most Canadians get more money back than what they pay, with checks being sent to Canadians every few months. Big industry pays more than the regular Canadian because industry pollutes more, and as a result, they have an incentive to reduce their pollution. The ideologically driven MAGA Conservatives are calling for pollution to be free again, and for the government to take those regular checks to Canadians away from them.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Everything he just said is factually wrong. One, industry doesn't pay the carbon tax. They have a carbon tax carve-out. And as for him claiming that people get more back in rebates, the Carleton mushroom farms will pay $100,000 this year, rising to $400,000 over the carbon tax increase the Prime Minister proposes. And he's sending them tiny rebate checks to their household mailbox. Is he committing today that he's going to send a $400,000 rebate to this family farm?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are there to support families, but multi-million-dollar farms that are successful will be continued to encourage to look for ways to use their machinery and to heat their produce in ways that is lower emitting. That's what fighting climate change is all about. It's encouraging successful farms like the Maderos family farm to continue to be successful, but to do so in ways that reduce their emissions. We know it cannot ever be free to pollute again, despite what the Conservative Party wants.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Ironically, it is free for Mexican producers to, almost free, they have a tiny, tiny little carbon tax, not even comparable to the $400,000 tax bill that this Prime Minister is proposing. So what he's saying is that there should be a price signal for Canadians to buy more expensive, polluting foreign food, while we, with the 5th biggest supply of arable land on planet Earth, shut our farmers down. How does that make any sense?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
More than just anyone else in this country, farmers understand how important it is to protect the land for future generations, to pass on the bounty to their children and grandchildren of a great, important job that feeds the rest of us. That is why farmers are so focused on the future, and that is why we are there to support them with a plan and investments that helps them reduce their emissions while they continue to put food on all our tables. We have a plan for that. The Conservative Party refuses to even admit that there needs to be work done to reduce emissions. That is not the way to build a future. Not in Carleton, not anywhere.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister claims that, actually, he stated correctly, that farmers are working hard to protect the environment, which is why it's so strange that he wants to punish them with a tax that on one farm alone costs $100,000, that will rise to $400,000 for the crime of using the only source of energy that is available to that farm. So I'll ask the same question I've asked him now about half a dozen times. When he finally gets around to talking to Carleton mushroom farms, how will he advise them to pay their forthcoming $400,000 carbon tax bill? By raising prices on Canadians or by cutting back and bringing in more dirty foreign food?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, 97% of farm fuel emissions are exempt from the price on pollution. The average farm across this country pays a little less than $1,000 on natural gas emissions through the price on pollution. So one can only imagine how much natural gas this successful mushroom farm must be using for their cost of the price on pollution to be that large. And we will happily work with them to switch towards a lower emitting approach to doing their business well and protecting future generations.
The Honourable Member for Montcalm. The government needed a positive announcement after its disastrous autumn session. And to please its centralist allies in the NDP, it chose dental care, a health service that actually already exists in Quebec. It chose an area under Quebec and provincial jurisdiction. It chose to interfere rather than support provinces in Quebec. Encroachment rather than collaboration. How can the Prime Minister justify making an announcement on dental care, a poor announcement on dental care, without having reached an agreement with Quebec? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, recently we launched a historic programme that will provide dental care for children from coast to coast to coast. And we've gone from this to a system that helps seniors as well. So seniors won't have to choose between paying their bills and taking care of their teeth. We will continue to work with provinces and territory, including Quebec, in order to make sure that Canadians who need it can have access to appropriate dental care without having to worry about the bill, and to improve the dental health of all Canadians from coast to coast to coast. The Honourable Member from Montcalm. In Quebec, the provincial healthcare system has been covering dental care for young people since the 70s. The Quebec government was ready to enter into an agreement to improve the plan. All the money transferred would be used for dental care. That was the plan. The Liberals knew this, but it's better for elections to elbow into Quebec's areas of jurisdiction than to simply transfer money. Quebec has the expertise, but the Liberals and the NDP chose Sun Life. Why did the Liberals choose a private company over RAMQ, Quebec's provincial healthcare system? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we have great dialogue with Quebec on how we will help Quebecers receive the services that they deserve. We will continue to work for them. We will continue to discuss with the government of Quebec, not with the second official party, the official opposition party here in Ottawa.
The Honourable Member from Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes.
Last night at committee, the hand-picked Liberal chair of this Prime Minister's billion-dollar Green Slush Fund was exposed as having used staff at the fund to round up $10 million for her project that had been deemed ineligible. And then she literally ran out of the committee, shutting off the cameras because she didn't want to answer any more questions. This NDP Liberal government failed to protect taxpayers from embezzlers and swindlers to the tune of $150 million. After 8 years, this Prime Minister isn't worth that cost. When will Canadians get back their missing millions?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Innovation has already accepted the resignation of the CEO and chair. When allegations are made and issues arise, it's both appropriate and necessary for there to be a review of the matter. Those investigations and reviews are currently underway, and we look forward to the results of those investigations.
The honourable member from Leeds Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
Well, it's going to be more in depth than the whitewash investigation that this Prime Minister and his minister put forward. They're under investigation by the Auditor General, 2 Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner investigations. Their board chair, his hand-picked chair, resigned in disgrace along with the CEO. The Prime Minister was handing out millions after his minister knew that his insiders had their hand in the cookie jar, taking 150 million taxpayer dollars. This Prime Minister isn't worth the cost after 8 years, and his NDP Liberal government couldn't be more out of touch. So who got rich and where did the missing millions go?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
In service of making cheap political points, the Conservative Party of Canada can't take yes for an answer. Independent officers of Parliament are investigating. A third-party review of the allegations is underway, and we're committed to ensuring organizations which receive federal funding adhere to the highest standards of governance. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to fighting climate change and drawing in investments from around the world, we have a plan, we have a focus on doing it in the right ways that's going to grow the economy and support Canadians. The Conservatives have no plan whatsoever. All they can do is try and play partisan political games.
That's right.
The honourable member from South Shore, St. Margaret's.
The Minister of Industry for 35 months as minister on this file. And the Prime Minister's handpicked chair of the Green Slush Fund admitted last night that she tried to get $2.2 million of taxpayer money funneled to the Visharian Centre Vanity Project from the fund she chairs. Then she got the employees of the Slush Fund to get another $10 million for the Visharian Vanity Project from Liberal ministers. She took the money and ran. Visharian claimed that was being an entrepreneur. We're calling it grifting. Why did the Prime Minister let his Green Slush Fund chair abuse the taxpayer for personal gain?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
The Minister has already addressed this question, and investigations are underway. But the work we are doing on fighting climate change is already cutting pollution while building a strong and competitive economy. While we work to advance our ambitious climate action, the Conservative Party has no plan because fighting climate change simply doesn't matter to them. The Conservative leader is turning his back on future generations, on both environment and economy, by refusing to commit to Canada's targets like his mentor Stephen Harper did when he withdrew from the Kyoto Accords.
The honourable member from Mégantic-Clérable. After 8 years with this Prime Minister, Liberal friends are still lining their pockets. The $1 billion Green Slush Fund was confirmed by explosive testimony from a courageous whistleblower. Do you remember the Bye-Bye Boss advert from Little Quebec when someone leaves their job because they won the lottery? Well, that's what the former chair of the Green Fund, appointed by the Prime Minister, did. She fled, running from a committee with her pockets full to the brim with $10 million. Mr. Speaker, when will the Prime Minister finally get Canadians' money back? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Minister has already addressed this issue. There's an investigation underway. With regards to the environment, we will go beyond the Harper government's objectives for 2030, and the most recent emission forecasts show that Canada is ready to reach its climate objectives for 2030. An objective that is new, tabled by a government, and attainable. Our plan works. The Conservatives' plan that encourages emissions will only benefit large companies that repeat the same slogans as he does.
The honourable member from Nunavut.
Adequate housing for Indigenous peoples have been neglected by Conservatives and Liberals. Thanks to the NDP, a for Indigenous by Indigenous housing strategy will now help First Nations, Métis, and Inuit to find adequate homes away from their home communities. But there is still work to do. Territorial governments like Nunavut are still waiting on this government to deliver funding for homes for their residents. Why are the Liberals always delaying critical funding for housing in the territories?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, we've demonstrated time and time again how committed we are to address housing gaps in Indigenous communities swiftly, effectively, and in equal partnership. Since 2016, we've supported the construction and renovation of over 30,000 homes in First Nations communities. We launched the $4 billion urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy, despite the Conservative Party voting to cut this essential funding. We will continue working with partners to co-develop and implement community-based housing solutions.
The honourable member from Edmonton-Griesbach.
Mr. Speaker, Edmonton families are making tough choices this winter. Put food on the table or buy Christmas presents for their kids. But who's stealing Christmas this year? Is it Scrooge? Is it the Grinch? No, it's the Liberal Conservative Corporate Coalition. They've let their grocery CEO friends jack up prices to make record profits while Canadians turn to food banks for Christmas dinner. Why is the government okay with letting grocery CEOs ruin the holidays for Edmonton families this winter?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've actually taken real actions to hold grocery CEOs to account with more competition, because more competition means lower prices, more choice, and more innovative products and services for Canadians. Our affordability legislation will empower the Competition Bureau to hold grocers accountable and prioritize consumers' interests. The Fall Economic Statement proposes further amendments to the Competition Act to crack down on predatory pricing and better respond to anti-competitive mergers and more. We're ensuring Canadians have more competitive options, and we're limiting excess profits by corporations at the expense of Canadians.
That's right. Hear, hear.
The honourable member from Charlottetown.
Mr. Speaker, Canadian veterans have fought for our country and deserve all the respect in the world. Our government has invested over $11 billion in new services and supports for veterans since 2016 and will always support those who have served to promote and defend Canadian values, both at home and in so-called faraway foreign lands. Can the Prime Minister update this House on what measures this government has taken to support our veterans?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the member for Charlottetown for his advocacy and his leadership on the Veterans Affairs Committee. One of the very first things we did when we formed government was to reverse the damaging Conservative cuts to veterans services. Veterans remember when that party cut programs, fired 1,000 veteran support staff, and closed 9 veterans offices, in all an attempt to nickel and dime veterans to balance the budget for an election. And we saw last week that nothing has changed when the Conservative Party voted to cut funding for our armed forces, and even worse, they voted last week to cut support for homeless veterans. The Canadian veterans know they cannot trust this Conservative leader.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, this is a Prime Minister who said veterans were asking for more than he could give. He sued them in court after he said he never would. He's caused the homelessness that he just talked about, and he spends the money on more bureaucracy instead of on our veterans. Now, he asked how much that the Carleton mushroom farms is spending on gas. He says they're spending too much. I have their bill records here, Mr. Speaker. In November alone, it was $11,866, prorated to about $100,000 a year, which he wants to quadruple to $400,000 a year. Once again, should the farm raise prices on consumers or cut production so polluting foreign farms get the business?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the average farm family, the average farm in Canada pays far less, around 1% of what that very successful farm is paying. Because the reality is 97% of farm fuel emissions are already exempt from the price on pollution. That is why we are continuing to move forward with programs and supports to encourage farms across the country, particularly very successful farms, to look at ways to reduce their emissions as they move forward into a net zero future.
That's right.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
So that's his attitude now. Remember when he called small businesses wealthy tax cheats? Now he accuses the Carleton Mushroom Farm of being Too successful. Therefore, they need to pay higher taxes. He clearly has no idea about our food supply chain because, of course, grains have to be dried, and the fuels for drying are now taxed. Barns have to be heated. Those barns, that heating, are now taxed. There's a common sense Conservative bill to axe the tax on those farmers to lower the price of the food. But if he doesn't believe that this tax costs farmers, will he sit down with the Madero's Carlton Mushroom Farm and inspect their bill personally?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our government reached out and will continue to reach out to a range of farmers across the country who want to reduce their emissions, who are concerned about climate change, who want to preserve our land for future generations, who understand, unlike these MAGA conservatives, that there is no choice anymore between protecting the environment and growing the economy. While the conservatives want to take us back to the Stone Age, we're going to continue to invest in supporting farms, supporting businesses, supporting Canadians while we reduce our pollution, reduce our emissions, and build a stronger future for everyone.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, he's missed all his targets except for the 1 year when the Canadians were locked down. His own Environment Commissioner says that he will come nowhere near meeting his 2030 targets. And now Canada ranks 58th out of 64 on the Climate Performance Index. So his tax is not working. And nor does he seem to understand how food arrives. Food doesn't come from the grocery store, Mr. Speaker. The average farmer in Canada has to spend $150,000 on his carbon tax for barns and drying, and that all has to go to the consumers. Won't he pass our common sense bill to axe the tax on food?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, when we took office 8 years ago, Canada had no plan to reach even its very modest, the Harper government's even very modest environmental targets. We not only have surpassed the Harper targets, we put in place new ambitious targets that we are very much on track to meeting, Mr. Speaker. We have decreased our emissions over the past 2 years faster than any other G7 country, and we will continue to lead the way on demonstrating that you cannot have a plan for the future of the economy if you don't have a plan to fight climate change. That's what we're doing. That's what they are not.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, he is wrong on the facts. Under the previous Conservative government, we actually reduced emissions while growing the economy. We did it through technology and not taxes. This Prime Minister, by the way, I said earlier that Canada ranked 58th out of 64. There's a new publication of the ranking, and Canada is now 62nd out of 67. In fact, we've fallen. The higher the tax, the worse the ranking. So, will the Prime Minister finally get rid of his tax plan and come up with an environment plan?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are on track to surpass Harper government's 2030 target, and the latest emissions projections show Canada is on track to achieving our government's new, ambitious and achievable 2030 climate goal. Our plan is working. We're seeing companies around the world invest in Canada. We were the third largest country in terms of foreign direct investment in the world earlier this year because people are noticing Canada's leadership on fighting against climate change. But that party continues to vote against measures to support our farmers, measures to invest in a cleaner economy, measures to protect Canadians and their economy from the challenges of the future. We will be there for Canadians.
L'honorable député de Lac-Saint-Jean.
Il y a deux solitudes.
There are two solitudes, even in the attitude towards asylum seekers. Quebec takes in half of Canada's asylum seekers, and we don't hesitate. We offer services first on our own dime, and then ask the federal government to reimburse the $460 million bill. People first, money second. The federal government, on the other hand, offers no services at all, and when it's time to pay, says it's not an ATM. It's a damn good thing Quebecers don't have the same attitude towards asylum seekers as the federal government. Will the Prime Minister do his part and reimburse Quebecers? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, every year we provide hundreds of millions of dollars to Quebec to help integrate newcomers, including to help them learn French. The immigration system will continue to be reinforced and bring its benefits to Quebec and the country. Immigration is essential to help businesses and find the workers that they need in order to grow our economy. We will always work very closely with the government of Quebec, whether it be on immigration, housing, or the economy.
L'honorable député de Lac-Saint-Jean.
Asylum seekers are the federal government's responsibility. And instead of repeating that it's not an ATM, the federal government has to stop treating Quebecers like its personal credit card. The entire bill for services to asylum seekers is being charged to it. Well, today the bill comes due. The Prime Minister has to pay his balance, and true to form, he's trying to get out of it. He doesn't like paying his debts. We know all about him. So we won't let this go. Will he take responsibility for asylum seekers and respect Quebecers and pay them back? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, for years we've sent hundreds of millions of dollars to Quebec to help with asylum seekers. We recognize how much Quebecers have shown generosity and been present for asylum seekers. And we will continue to be there to help because Canada is a welcoming country, but also a country that has to make sure everyone is well protected when they get here, even asylum seekers. We will continue to work with Quebec. We will continue to be there to support asylum seekers because that's the right thing to do.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
After 8 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost of housing. According to the Bank of Canada, we have the worst affordability since 41 years. Rents have doubled, and now it costs more to rent one bedroom in a shared apartment than it did for the whole apartment when this Prime Minister took power. Evictions in Quebec have gone up by 132%. It's the main cause of homelessness. Will the Prime Minister finally reverse policies that favor bureaucracy and help with homelessness? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. The Conservative leader said what he thinks by stating that the federal government should pull out of building affordable housing, but we're not going to follow that irresponsible advice. Maybe that's why last week his party voted against funding for building 71,000 new apartments and voted against more than 1,500 new housing units for most vulnerable people. We will not partisan games from the Conservatives undermine our efforts to get housing for everyone. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. All of those apartment housing units have one thing in common. They don't exist. They don't exist. 8 years ago, they promised to spend $97 million on affordable housing. And we've seen rents doubled and mortgages. In Quebec, 132% increase in evictions is now the main cause of homelessness after 8 years of this Prime Minister. When will he recognize that increasing bureaucracy and inflation doesn't help with housing? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, last week, the Conservative Party voted against 71,000 new apartment units. They voted against 15,000 affordable housing units. And their excuse now is that they don't exist yet, so we can vote against it. Come on. That's really a lack of understanding of the responsibility of a government to invest to create a better future, to solve problems. Mr. Speaker, he just wants to increase distress, whereas on this side of the House, We are going to stand up for Canadians in spite of the Conservatives who oppose all these measures. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Same thing he's done for 8 years. He spent $87 billion on housing affordability to double housing costs. We have fewer homes per capita than we did when he took office, the fewest homes of any country in the G7. He doubled the rent, doubled mortgage payments, doubled the needed down payment, to the point where the Bank of Canada reports this week that Canada has the worst housing affordability in 41 years. And Rent.ca reveals that it's now more expensive to rent one room in a shared apartment than it was 8 years ago to rent the entire apartment for oneself. Mr. Speaker, when will he realize that ballooning inflation and the bureaucracy doesn't build homes?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, when will the Leader of the Official Opposition understand that voting against the construction of 71,000 new homes through the Apartment Construction Loan Program is not going to help anyone? That voting against the construction of 12,000 new affordable homes through the Rapid Housing Initiative will not help Canadians. He chose to play partisan games last week in trying to shut down this House through a MAGA-inspired approach while we continue to stand up for Canadians and deliver on the things they need. While they play partisan games, we will continue to fight for Canadians.
L'honorable député de Sudbury.
Monsieur le Président, le secteur du tourisme.
Mr. Speaker, the tourism sector reaches all regions of the country and is also the second largest employer in rural areas. 40% of tourism jobs are in rural areas. Can the Prime Minister tell this House how the government supports millions of workers in the tourism sector? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. I thank the member for Sudbury for her excellent question and her hard work. Last week, the Conservative Party voted against programs to support Canadians and turn their backs on the 2 million tourism sector workers. They voted against funding to support tourism growth in the country. Workers in that sector deserve better, unlike the Conservatives, who only support workers during their advertising campaigns. On this side of the House, we will continue to support workers in the tourism sector.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, Maclean's magazine reports, and I quote, 2 jobs, no money, how mortgage rates have pushed one Toronto father to the brink. And I quote, 2 years into our mortgage, their bi-weekly payments have reached $2,268, now paying more than $5,000 a month to live in a 900-square-foot townhouse, and $3,500 of that goes to interest. Mr. Speaker, all of his spending programs have doubled the cost of housing, and according to Bank of Nova Scotia, have boosted interest rates another 2%. Will he realize the damage he's doing in causing Canadians unsupportable and sustainable mortgage?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we recognize the challenges Canadians are facing, and on this side of the House, we've chosen to invest to support them, to create new affordable housing, to create new apartments. But, Mr. Speaker, as much as the Leader of the Opposition loves to rise in this House to talk about Canadians and suffering, he will not rise in this House to support solutions to Canadians' challenges. He rose in the House to vote against 71,000 new rental homes through the Apartment Construction Loan Program. He rose in this House to vote against 12,000 new affordable homes through the Rapid Housing Initiative. He likes to instrumentalize Canadians. He won't solve for them.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Voted against an approach that has spent $87 billion on affordable housing to double the cost of housing. He thinks that if he's expensive, he's excused for his failures. Mr. Speaker, failing is bad. Failing expensively is even worse. Our common sense plan would require cities permit 15% more housing as a condition of getting their financing, give them bonuses if they beat the target, link the dollars they get for transit to requirements for apartments around them, and sell off 6,000 federal buildings and thousands of acres of federal land to build, build, build. Why can't he get behind that common sense plan?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, inflation has gone up, interest rates have gone up, food prices have gone up, energy prices have gone up, all linked to the ongoing war that Russia is waging in Ukraine. We recognize that on this side of the House, and we are acting not just to bring down prices here at home, but to stand with Ukraine in our fight against Russia. Unfortunately, the leader of the official opposition, who referred to Ukraine as a faraway land, refuses to stand up to deliver for Ukraine. Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we will always be there for Ukraine.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, he's not there for Ukraine, he's there for himself. When Conservatives demanded that the government provide lethal weapons before Putin's invasion, when they most needed them, he said no. When Conservatives kicked Putin out of the G8, made it the G7, he said no. And what he said yes to giving Putin an exported big, powerful turbine to pump his gas and fill his war chest and export detonators used for Russian mines that blow up Ukrainians, Mr. Speaker. That's not there for Ukrainians. We will stand for Ukrainians and for Canadians.
The Right Honourable, the Right Honourable. Order. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I am delighted to find ourselves in an argument about which side of the House is more supportive of Ukraine, because one of the strengths that Canada has had on the world stage these past difficult 2 years is that we've said there is no debate around support in Ukraine in Canada like there is in other countries where MAGA-inspired far-right movements are undermining supports for Ukraine. The Conservative Party of Canada has an opportunity to reverse its position in opposing the Ukraine free trade deal that Zelensky is asking for. Will they vote in favor of Ukraine free trade?
Order. The Honourable Member from Etobicoke Centre.
Mr. Speaker, our government has been clear on where we stand on the war in Ukraine. We know that Ukrainians...
I'm going to ask colleagues, please. This member is very far away from the Speaker. The Speaker would like to hear the member. The Honourable Member from Etobicoke Centre.
Mr. Speaker, our government has been clear on where we stand on the war in Ukraine. We understand that Ukrainians are not just fighting for their own freedom and survival, but that they're also fighting for us, and that we need to be fighting for them.
Non seulement que moi j'ai des difficultés à entendre le...
Not only am I having trouble hearing the Honourable Member for Etobicoke Centre when he's asking his question, I see that there are members on the other side of the House who are having trouble hearing the question. I invite the member for Etobicoke Centre to restart their question.
Mr. Speaker, our government has been clear as to where we stand on the war in Ukraine. We understand that the Ukrainian people are not just fighting for their own freedom and survival, but that they're also fighting for us, and that we need to be fighting for them.
I'm going to ask the member from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, please, to wait his turn to ask a question. I'll also ask the member from Provencher to keep it down so that we could have this question asked. The honourable member from Etobicoke Centre from the top, please.
Mr. Speaker, it is clear where our government stands on Ukraine. We understand that the Ukrainian people are not only fighting for their own freedom and survival, but they're also fighting for us, and that we need to be fighting for them. It is also clear where Conservative MPs stand. Their leader has never advocated for more military, financial, or humanitarian support for Ukraine. They voted against the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, and yesterday, the leader of the Conservative Party dismissively referred to Ukraine as a faraway foreign land. Under this leader,
Colleagues. I notice that members will wait until I've actually recognized a member to then start heckling again. I'm asking once again, please. And if members are going to have the ability to heckle, then please have the way to identify yourselves who are heckling and not leaning back to try to cover your face from other members so that the speaker can't hear. So I'm going to ask the honourable members to please allow the member from Etobicoke Centre so that we all can get back to the business of doing the people's work. The honourable member from Etobicoke Centre, I regret, from the top.
Mr. Speaker, our government has been clear as to where we stand on the war in Ukraine. We know that the Ukrainian people are not only fighting for their own freedom and survival, but that they're also fighting for us, and that we need to be fighting for them. It is also clear now where Conservative MPs stand. Their leaders never advocated for more military, financial, or humanitarian support for Ukraine. They voted against the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, and yesterday, the leader of the Conservative Party referred dismissively to Ukraine as a far-away foreign land. Under this leader, the Conservative Party has abandoned Ukraine. Could the Prime Minister please reassure Canadians that this government will stand with the Ukrainian people until they win?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we really see how much they hate it when we talk about Ukraine. I thank the member for Etobicoke Centre for his leadership in supporting Ukraine. The Conservative Party, yet again, showed Ukrainians and all Canadians who they really are. When it came time to support military aid to Ukraine, they voted against. When it came time to support Operation Unifier, they voted against. When it came to the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, twice they voted against. While the Conservative leader is busy taking talking points from Fox News and Donald Trump, on this side of the House, we support Ukraine!
The honourable member from Courtenay, Alberni.
Mr. Speaker, even though small businesses are dealing with a cost of living crisis, the Liberals are forcing them to pay back the Canada Emergency Business Account loan within the next few weeks, or risk losing up to $20,000. And while the Liberals put small businesses in jeopardy, they're handing out $21.6 billion to their rich consultant friends. Reducing this out-of-control outsourcing by just 4% more would cover the cost of extending the CEBA. So instead of choosing rich CEOs and highly paid consultants, will the Liberals support small businesses by extending the CEBA by just 1 year?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, during the pandemic, we stepped up with unprecedented supports for small businesses. We were there to support them. We were there to invest in them. We were there to support Canadian workers, Canadian families, Canadian seniors. We were there with supports that saw us through this pandemic with fewer deaths and a stronger economy than most of our peers. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, we were there to help Canadians through the pandemic, and we're going to continue to support small businesses in many different ways. But the pandemic is over in its acute phase. We will continue to be there to support people, but pandemic supports needed to end.
The honourable member from Kitchener Centre.
Mr. Speaker, despite climate negotiations being captured by fossil fuel interests, countries just agreed at COP28 to transition away from fossil fuels. Yet back at home, this government continues to do the opposite, wasting over $1,200 on behalf of each and every Canadian taxpayer to expand the TMX pipeline and increasing oil production to record levels. Why is it this PM can't find the money to ensure we end legislated poverty for people with disabilities, but has tens of billions of dollars for a leaky pipeline?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Canada demonstrated yet again its leadership on the world stage with ambitious leadership in putting a cap on emissions from the oil and gas sector, on recognizing that we do need to get to a net zero economy, and we need to support all our industries, including our energy industry, in moving towards that. We will be there to support workers in the energy industry as we focus on decarbonization. We will be there to support businesses across this country as they shift to lower emitting technologies. We understand the process it takes. We will accompany Canadians every step of the way, and we will get to net zero.
Hear, hear.
And that brings to an end question period. I see rising on a point of order is the Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, there have been discussions among the parties, and if you seek it, I believe you would find unanimous consent to adopt the following motion. That the motion standing on the order paper in the name of the Leader of the Government in the House of Commons related to the appointment of Eric Jantz as Clerk of the House of Commons pursuant to Standing Order 111.1-1 be deemed adopted.
All those opposed to the Honourable Minister moving the motion will please say nay. Agreed. The House has heard the terms of the motion. All those opposed to the motion will please say nay. Carried.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint-Laurent. A point of order. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thrice today, the Leader of the Opposition, of the official opposition, referred to a document that was tabled at COP28. This document, Climate Change Performance Index. I apologise, but there are no's from others in this chamber.
Rising on another point of order, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that if you reflect in terms of what had taken place over question period and the amount of decorum, and this is something I think is really important, Mr. Speaker.
I'll just ask the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to please quote the standing order so that the Speaker can hear.
A member of Ukrainian heritage, a member from the Centre, on several occasions tried to get his question across.
So I'm just wondering if the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary would like to quote the point of order that he is referring to so that I can listen.
18, Mr. Speaker, Section 18 of the standing orders, in reference to decorum, the member of Ukrainian heritage, the member from Etobicoke Centre, on several occasions attempted to get his question across, Mr. Speaker, and as I am right now, is being shouted down as opposed to being allowed to be heard. And we believe, Mr. Speaker, that you should take a look at those questions and report back, because we are starting to see the MAGA right from the Conservative Party.
I thank the honourable member. I see the honourable member from Haldeman Norfolk is rising on. The honourable member from Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
On January 18, when I was given my SO31 on Ukraine, the Liberals heckled me the entire time. And Mr. Speaker, I have to say that during
I'm just going to ask the honourable member if he could quote the. I'm asking the honourable member just to quote the standing order in which he's raising. So the honourable member. He did.
So on the issue of decorum and Standing Order 18, I, a person of Ukrainian heritage, the entire time I was given my SO31, was heckled and yelled at by the Liberals. And when you look at the member from Etobicoke Centre, when he got up, he actually misinformed the House when he said that we were opposed to Ukraine. When actually the Liberals voted against all the early issues and measures we took as a government and as Conservatives. They voted consecutively in 2014 and 2015 against measures to support Ukraine, Operation Unifier, Operation Reassurance.
We are now moving into. So, colleagues, we are now. We are now moving into issues of debate on I recognize the honourable member from Haldeman first to raise on a point of order.
There have been discussions among the parties, and I'm sure if you seek it, you will find that Bill C-234 will lower the cost.
So I regret I'm hearing a lot of no's from other members that there's not unanimous consent to see to proceed. The honourable member from Kingston and the Island is rising on a point of order, and I hope he will quote the point of order in which he is rising on.
I'm further contributing to the point of order raised by the member from Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman in regards to Standing Order 18 and decorum. I just wanted to point out for the member, there were only 34 Liberals here when he was claiming all these votes occurred. I'd like to know if he wants to say which ones voted that way.
So we are going to move on now. It being 3:31, the House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motion at second reading stage of Bill S-210 under private members' business. Call in the members. The question is as follows. Madame Vecchio, appuyée par Madame.
Mrs. Vecchio, seconded by Mrs. Veen, moved that Bill S-210, an act to restrict young persons' online access to sexually explicit material, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security.
The
10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote. We will start with the sponsor of the item. We will now proceed to members participating in person. All those at my left in favour of the motion will please rise. Sixth row to my left.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Ruff.
Mr. Ruff.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
Monsieur Désiré.
Monsieur Désiré.
Madame Hughes.
Madame Hughes.
Cinquième rangée.
Fifth row to my left.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Tolney.
Mr. Tolney.
Mrs. Wagentall.
Mrs. Wagentall.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Mott.
Mr. Mott.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Madame Sinclair Desgagnés.
Madame Sinclair Desgagnés.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Backrack.
Quatrième rangée.
Fourth row to my left.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redekop.
Mr. Redekop.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Ms. Rude.
Ms. Rude.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Mazier.
Mr. Mazier.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford Lloydminster.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Gould.
Monsieur Gould.
Mr. Currick.
Mr. Currick.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Vidal.
Ms. Gazan.
Ms. Gazan.
Mr. Green.
Mr. Green.
Troisième rangée.
Third row to my left.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Monsieur Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Ms. Gladue.
Ms. Gladue.
Mr. Chambers.
Mr. Chambers.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Mr. Canning.
Mr. Canning.
Mr. Johns.
Mr. Johns.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Deuxième.
Second row to my left.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Monsieur Berthold.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Aboutaïf.
Mr. Aboutaïf.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Monsieur Garon.
Monsieur Garon.
Madame Gill.
Madame Gill.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Ms. Blaney.
Ms. Blaney.
Ms. Idlout.
Ms. Idlout.
Première rangée.
First row to my left.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Commit.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Ms. Lanceman.
Ms. Lanceman.
Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Barrett.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Ms. Kwan.
Ms. Kwan.
Que tous ceux à ma...
All those at my right in favour of the motion will please rise. Sixth row to my right.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Fifth row to my right.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Monsieur Chiffquet.
Mr. Chiffquet.
Madame Lambropoulos.
Madame Lambropoulos.
Third row to my right.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Sousa.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Morris.
Troisième rang.
Now back to the third row to my right.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Blakey.
Second row to my right.
Mr. McKay.
Mr. McKay.
Mr. McGinty.
Mr. McGinty.
Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins.
Ms. McPherson.
Ms. McPherson.
Première.
First row to my right.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Matheson.
All those at my left opposed to the motion will please rise. 6th row, 5th row, 4th row, 3rd row, 2nd row, 1st row. All those at my right opposed to the motion will please rise.
Mr. Lewis, Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis, Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Madame Chatel.
Madame Chatel.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Ms. Kayabaga.
Ms. Kayabaga.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Mr. Carr.
Mr. Carr.
5th row at my right.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Monsieur Robillard.
Monsieur Robillard.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Mr. Sobara.
Mr. Sobara.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Mr. Aldag.
Mr. Aldag.
Mr. Baker.
Mr. Baker.
Ms. Latanzio.
Ms. Latanzio.
4th row at my right.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Briard.
Madame Briard.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
3e rangée à ma droite.
3rd row at my right.
Dhaliwal.
Mr. Dhaliwal.
Mrs. Romanato.
Mrs. Romanato.
Ms. O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Ms. Sahota.
Ms. Sahota.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Baptiste.
2e rangée à ma
2nd row at my right.
Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Vandal.
Mr. Vandal.
Ms. Cara.
Ms. Cara.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Mrs. Valdez.
Mrs. Valdez.
Ms. Jazek.
Ms. Jazek.
Madame Fortier.
Madame Fortier.
1e rangée à ma droite.
1st row at my right.
Mr. O'Regan.
Mr. O'Regan.
Ms. Gould.
Ms. Gould.
Monsieur Boissonneau.
Mr. Boissonneau.
Mr. Varani.
Mr. Varani.
Ms. Sachs.
Ms. Sachs.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Bennett.
La Chambre attendra.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end.
Je désire informer la...
I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended. If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them.
Le bureau va maintenant compiler les...
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Nays pour 189, 189. Nays contre 133, 133.
Je déclare la motion adoptée.
I declare the motion carried.
Je reconnais l'honorable député.
I recognize the Honourable Member for Portneuf, Jacques Cartier, on a point of order? Or rather, my apologies, excuse me. I forgot to mention one thing that I must do first. Accordingly, the bill stands referred to the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. I now recognize the Honourable Member for Portneuf, Jacques Cartier, on a point of order. Mr. Speaker, during the voice vote for a very important vote to protect youth against pornography, the member for Pontiac rose. Maybe she didn't realize what she was doing, but she rose to vote for and rose to vote against. Mr. Speaker, I would like us to revise the vote to make sure that the vote was correct, and I hope she voted for. I will consult the table before responding to the honourable member.
Je remercie l'honorable député.
I thank the Honourable Member for Portneuf, Jacques Cartier, for raising this point of order. I have checked with the clerks, and the vote was only counted once.
La Chambre procédera.
The House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on motion M96 under private member's business in the name of Mr. Hardy.
The question is as follows. Mr. Hardy, seconded by Mr. Aldag, move that the House recognize that an assessment by the International Association of Firefighters... May I dispense? May I dispense? May I dispense? Thank you. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote. We will start with the sponsor of the item. The Honourable Member from
Mr. Hardy.
Starting with the sixth row, we will now proceed to all those at my right who favour the motion will please rise. Starting with the sixth row.
Mr. Lewis, Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis, Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Madame Chatel.
Madame Chatel.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald-Malpeck.
Mr. McDonald-Malpeck.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Mr. Carr.
Mr. Carr.
Fifth row at my right.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Monsieur Robillard.
Monsieur Robillard.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Mr. Aldag.
Mr. Aldag.
Ms. Latanzio.
Ms. Latanzio.
Fourth row at my right.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Sidhu Brampton East.
Mr. Sidhu Brampton East.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Sanson.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
Third row at my right.
Mr. Dhaliwal.
Mr. Dhaliwal.
Madame Lalonde.
Madame Lalonde.
Mrs. Romanado.
Mrs. Romanado.
Ms. O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Ms. Sahota.
Ms. Sahota.
Mr. Fragiscatos.
Mr. Fragiscatos.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Blakey.
Second row at my right.
Mr. McKay.
Mr. McKay.
Mr. McGinty.
Mr. McGinty.
Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Monsieur Vandal.
Monsieur Vandal.
Ms. Cara.
Ms. Cara.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Mrs. Valdez.
Mrs. Valdez.
Ms. Jazek.
Ms. Jazek.
Madame Fortier.
Madame Fortier.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins.
Ms. McPherson.
Ms. McPherson.
First row at my right.
Mr. O'Regan.
Mr. O'Regan.
Monsieur Rodriguez.
Monsieur Rodriguez.
Ms. Gould.
Ms. Gould.
Monsieur Boissonneau.
Monsieur Boissonneau.
Ms. Sachs.
Miss Sachs.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Bennett.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Matheson.
All those at my left who are in favor of the motion will please rise. Sixth row.
Madame Hughes.
Madame Hughes.
Row.
Madame Sinclair de Gagné.
Sinclair de Gagné.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Backrack.
Oh, at my left.
Ms. Gazan.
Ms. Gazan.
Mr. Green.
Mr. Green.
Third row at my left.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Johns.
Mr. Johns.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Second row at my left.
Madame Gill.
Madame Gill.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Ms. Blaney.
Ms. Blaney.
Ms. Idlout.
Ms. Idlout.
Première rangée à ma gauche.
First row at my left.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Ms. Kwan.
Ms. Kwan.
Que tous ceux à ma droite qui s'opposent.
All those at my right opposed to the motion will please rise.
Rangée.
Sixth row.
Cinquième rang.
Fifth row.
Troisième rang.
Third row.
Deuxième.
Second row.
Première rangée.
First row.
Que tous ceux à...
All those at my left opposed to the motion will please rise. Sixth row.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Ruff.
Mr. Ruff.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
Cinquième rangée à ma gauche.
Fifth row at my left.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Tolney.
Mr. Tolney.
Mrs. Wagentall.
Mrs. Wagentall.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Quatrième rangée à ma gauche.
Fourth row at my left.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Monsieur Lou.
Monsieur Lou.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Major.
Mr. Major.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford Lloydminster.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Gould.
Monsieur Gould.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Troisième rangée à ma gauche.
Third row at my left.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mrs. Robert.
Mrs. Roberts.
Ms. Gladue.
Ms. Gladue.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Deuxième rangée.
Second row at my left.
Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Bazin.
Mr. Bazin.
Monsieur Berthold.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Aboutaïf.
Mr. Aboutaïf.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
First row to my left.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Barrett.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
For those of you that are new to the channel and you want to help support the channel, you can do so by hitting the like and subscribe.
Je désire informer la Chambre.
I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended.
Pas pu voter en raison de...
If members were unable to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them.
From Mississauga.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, my voting app didn't work and I vote in favor.
Oh, thank you.
Didn't he already?
Le bureau va maintenant...
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour, 211, 211. Nays contre, 112, 112.
Je déclare la motion adoptée.
I declare the motion carried.
Je suis maintenant prêt à me prononcer.
I am now prepared to rule.
Je désire informer la...
I would wish to inform the House that due to the vote, government orders will be extended by 26 minutes.
J'ai l'honneur de faire savoir à la Chambre.
I have the honor to inform the House that a message has been received from the Senate informing this House that the Senate has passed the following bill with amendments to which the concurrence of the House is desired. Bill C-234, an act to amend the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act. Copies of the amendments are available at the table.
Je suis maintenant prêt à me prononcer sur la question.
I'm now prepared to rule on the question of privilege raised on December 1st, 2023 by the member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte regarding allegedly misleading information shared by the Minister of Public Services and Procurement and the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence. In his intervention, the member alleged that the House had been misled about the process to replace the Aurora aircraft. The member noted that when the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence and the Minister of Public Services and Procurement were asked about this matter in the House on November 24th and 28th, 2023, they both answered that the decision to award a sole source contract to Boeing had not yet been made. Yet, according to the member, a newspaper article published on November 29th revealed that the government knew by then that the contract had been awarded. In the member's view, the government's answers were knowingly inaccurate and effectively misled the House.
Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader explained that the responses from the Minister and the Parliamentary Secretary were accurate at the time they were provided, as the government's final decision was not made until the evening of November 28. Given the circumstances, he concluded that the House could not have been misled and that there are no grounds to find a prima facie case, a prima facie question of privilege, rather. The House is therefore faced with one version of events based on an article published in a newspaper and another provided by the Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader, indicating that, based on the sequence of events, no misleading information was provided. In cases such as this, the Chair's role is strictly limited to determining whether, during the proceedings, a member deliberately misled the House. Pour en arriver à la conclusion,
in order to find a prima facie question of privilege, 3 criteria must be met. These criteria are set out in numerous decisions issued by previous speakers, including one by my predecessor on May 11th, 2021, on page 7022 of the debates, and I quote, "First, the statement must effectively be misleading or manifestly contradictory. Second, the author of the statement must know in making the statement that it is false. And third, the member intended to mislead the House." Unquote.
The threshold for showing that the House was deliberately misled is very high because the consequences of such allegations can be quite serious. Accordingly, the Chair carefully reviewed the statements the Minister and the Parliamentary Secretary made during oral questions. La Présidence comprend.
The Chair understands how important it is for members to receive the most reliable and accurate information possible in order to carry out their duties. However, the chair could not find evidence that the minister and the parliamentary secretary contradicted themselves or intended to hide information from or mislead the House. As a consequence, and in keeping with many precedents on such matters, I cannot, in this case, find a prima facie question of privilege. I thank all members for their attention.
Affaires courantes ordinaires. Dépôt de
Routine proceedings. Tabling of documents. The Government House Leader.
We'll go Minister Ng first. I'll go. Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 36-8A, I have the honor to table in both official languages the government's responses to 3 petitions. These returns will be tabled in an electronic format, Mr. Speaker.
Tabling of documents, the Honourable Minister of Export Promotion, International Trade and Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 32-2 and in accordance with the enhanced transparency requirements relating to new free trade agreements introduced in the policy on tabling of treaties in Parliament in 2020, I'm pleased to notify the House of Commons of the government's intent to initiate negotiations for a Canada-Ecuador free trade agreement. The Government of Canada intends to commence negotiations with Ecuador no earlier than 90 days from the date of this notice. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Introduction of government bills. Dépôt de projet de loi, émanant du gouvernement. Déclaration.
Statements by ministers.
From interparliamentary delegations. The Honourable Member for Ottawa South.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 34-1, I have the honour to present to the House in both official languages the report of the Canadian Group of the Interparliamentary Union, its 145th Assembly and related meetings in Kigali, Rwanda, from October 11th to 15th, 2022. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Rapport de délégation interparlementaire.
Reports from interparliamentary delegations. The Honourable Member for Vaughan Woodbridge.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 34-1, I have the honour to present to the House in both official languages the following reports of the Canada-Europe Association respecting its participation at the second part of the 2023 Ordinary Session of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, PACE, Strasbourg, France, from April 24th, 2023, and the Canada-Europe Association respecting its participation at the meeting of the Standing Committee of Parliamentarians of the Arctic Region, Washington, D.C., USA, from April 25th, 26th, 2023, and the Canada-Europe Association respecting its participation at the extraordinary meeting of the Standing Committee for the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, PACE, Reykjavik, Iceland, May 15th, 2023, and the Canada-Europe Association respecting its participation at the third part of the 2023 Ordinary Session of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, PACE, Strasbourg, France, from June 19th to 23rd, 2023. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Rapport de délégation interparlementaire. The Honourable Member for Scarborough-Guildwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pursuant to Standing Order 34-1, I have the honour to present to the House in both official languages 5 reports. The first one being the Canada-United States Interparliamentary Group Midwestern Legislative Conference, Council of State Governments, Wichita, Kansas, from July 10th to July 13th in 2022. The Canada-U.S. Interparliamentary Group Council of State Governments, the 61st Annual Meeting, Manchester, New Hampshire, August 14th to 17, 2022. The Canada-U.S. Interparliamentary Group bilateral visit with members of the United States Senate, Washington, D.C., from May 15 to 16, 2023. The Canada-U.S. Interparliamentary Group Western Governors Conference Association, Boulder, Colorado, from June 26 to June 28, 2023. And finally, Mr. Speaker, the Canada-U.S. Parliamentary Council State Governments Midwestern Legislative Conference, Detroit, Michigan, July 9th to July 12th, 2023. As you can see, Mr. Speaker, and I want to, while I'm on my feet, thank the members for this work. As you can see, it actually, in many instances, took place during members' vacation time, and I want to thank them for their attendance to this most important relationship. And I also want to acknowledge and thank Senators Klobuchar and Crapo for their generous and warm welcome to our delegation while in Washington. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting reports from committees, the Honourable Member for Fleetwood Port Kells.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually have 3 reports to table today in both official languages. On behalf of the Chair of the Fisheries and Oceans Committee, the Honourable Member from Avalon, I have the honour to present in both official languages the following 2 reports of the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. The 12th report, entitled Ecosystem Impacts and Management of Pinniped Population. And for the folks at home, pinnipeds mean seals and sea lions. And the 13th report, entitled Foreign Ownership and Corporate Concentration of Fishing Licenses and Quota. And while I'm on my feet, I have the pleasure to present as chair of the committee. I have the honor to present in both official language the 5th interim report of the Special Committee on the Canada People's Republic of China relationship, entitled The Exposure of Canadian Investment Funds to Human Rights Violations in the People's Republic of China. Pursuant to Standing Order 109, the committee requests that the government table a comprehensive response to all of these reports.
Honourable Member, for those on the 12th report, I believe there's a dissenting opinion from the Honourable Member for Coast of Bay Central Notre Dame.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to table our Conservative supplementary report on ecosystem impacts and management of pinniped populations. The report was completed because Conservative members of the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans believe that the main report does not represent the urgency required to deal with management of pinnipeds fast enough to save fish stocks on all 3 of Canada's coasts. Witnesses at this study, the mackerel study, and our science study all stressed that paying lip service to pinniped predation, as the Liberals have over the last 8 years, is simply not enough. We call on this government to commit to an education campaign to raise awareness to the ecological disaster that has occurred as a result of the imbalance caused by exploding seal and sea lion populations in Canada's coastal regions. This report also calls on the federal government to start lobbying in conjunction with this awareness campaign to gain access to international markets and promote pinniped products to help feed the millions of malnourished as a part of Canada's foreign aid program. The committee heard it loud and clear, Mr. Speaker. The time for action is now.
And I believe on the 13th report, there's a dissenting opinion coming from the Honourable Member for North Okanagan, Shuswap.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Conservative members on the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans submitted our supplemental report to this study on foreign ownership and corporate concentration of fishing licenses and quotas because Canada's fisheries are shared common resources owned by the citizens of Canada. The Minister of Fisheries and Oceans and her department are entrusted and mandated to manage and conserve Canada's fisheries for the sustained benefit and prosperity of Canadians, not foreign entities. In the committee's study, we learned how the government is severely failing to protect Canadian harvesters who have been forced to pay for the government's failure. Law and regulations on the East Coast are not being enforced, leaving harvesters vulnerable to exploitation that should have and could have been shut down, eliminated years ago. On the West Coast, the government has failed to even establish laws and regulation to protect harvesters and fisheries from foreign ownership and corporate concentration. The committee delivered recommendations to the government in 2019, but the government has failed to deliver on those recommendations. To Canadian harvesters on all coasts, Conservatives hear you and see the threats you are facing. We will continue to fight to ensure that Canadians can access and earn prosperity from the shared resources of Canada's fisheries. Thank you.
Présentation de rapport de comité.
Presenting reports from committees, the Honourable Member for Ottawa-Vanier. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope you can hear me well enough. I have the honour to present in both official languages the 14th report of the Standing Committee on International Trade on non-tariff barriers to trade, some Canadian perspectives. I'd also like to thank the members of the committee and the clerk of the committee and the analysts for their hard work. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Introduction of private members' bills. Mr. Bachrach, seconded by Mr. Cannings, moves for leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Canada Transportation Act, Passenger Rail Service. This motion is deemed adopted. The Honourable Member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today as the NDP's transport critic to table the Rail Passenger Priority Act. As many in this chamber know, Canada lags behind much of the world when it comes to passenger rail, and one of the key reasons for that is because passenger trains in Canada frequently have to pull off and make way for freight trains, and this results in poor on-time performance. This bill will amend the Canada Transportation Act to give passenger trains in Canada priority on the tracks, just as federal law does in the United States, and as was recently recommended by the CEO of Via Rail. Mr. Speaker, Canada has the opportunity to seize the full potential of safe, convenient, climate-friendly passenger rail in this country. And on Sunday, I'll be setting out by train across our beautiful country to speak with passengers and communities about how the Rail Passenger Priority Act is an important part of that endeavor. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Merry Christmas.
Great idea. Merry Christmas to you as well. Mr. Bachrach, seconded by Mr. Cannings, moves that the bill be now read a first time and be printed. This motion is deemed adopted.
When shall the bill be read a second time? At the next sitting of the House.
We're going first reading of Senate public bills. Motions. Mr. Barlow, seconded by Ms. Rood, moves that the 10th report of the Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food, presented on Tuesday, June 13, 2023, be concurred in. Having a point of order from the Honourable Member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
I wonder, Mr. Speaker, if you canvass the room, whether there would be unanimous consent to allow some of us to present petitions that we have been waiting for weeks to present, but we've been faced with a series of motions of concurrence and other delays, and I have citizens who have been asking me to present this petition and wondering why I haven't been able to. So I'm just asking.
So the motion is unanimous consent to allow petitions to go. All those in favor, oppose. All those opposed to the honourable member moving the motion, please say nay. Nay. I'm hearing a number of nays. And also a point of order from the honourable member from Courtney Alberni.
Mr. Speaker, just on a similar point of order, the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs have requested that I table this petition today. So I'm going to ask you if you could canvass the House and allow some of us to table petitions on behalf of the volunteer firefighters that put their lives at risk to protect everybody in our community, especially in rural Canada. And I'm hoping that you'll get unanimous consent so that we can table these petitions on behalf of these wonderful volunteers that sacrifice their time and energy for all of us.
That's right. Okay, so while we're on the same point of order, the honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Maybe it's just helpful for members to say that there's concurrence motions, which go for a maximum of 3 hours, and then there's an opportunity for petitions. And if this debate concludes, there will be an opportunity for petitions. I know there was an opportunity for petitions yesterday. Members have other ways they can table petitions, but I hope if we don't spend too much time on points of order that there will actually be an opportunity to get to petitions later in the day. And we'll see if the NDP actually put up speakers on the concurrence. That will impact the timeline as well.
That same point of order, the honourable member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Mr. Speaker, on that same point of order, I'd like to express my disappointment that I'm unable to rise today and table a petition on behalf of several chambers of commerce in Northwest BC and hundreds of small businesses across Canada concerning the CEBA loans and the partial loan forgiveness. This is something supported by the Canadian Federation for Independent Business and many other organizations, and it's disappointing that so late in the session I'm not able to table such an important petition.
And while we're at it, the honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
So I wonder, Mr. Speaker, if we could seek the House's unanimous consent. It sounds like there are 3 petitions that are particularly timely, one from the member for North Okanagan, one for Courtenay Alberni, and one for the member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley. And I wonder if the House might have consent to hear those 3 particularly timely petitions.
So the motion is to allow those 3. 1, 2, 3, as I count them. So all those opposed to the honourable. Sure, the honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
On the point of order, respectfully, my understanding of the rules is that if we proceed to petitions, we are no longer in motions. So maybe there should be a discussion among House leaders about how to ensure we don't lose where we are on motions. But we're in motions right now, and we need to discuss this motion. So.
Right. So if it is and I'll go to the honourable House Leader for the NDP in a second. But if it is the will of the House to hear 3 petitions, we can hear those 3 petitions and then go back to the motion as it is predetermined here. So we can hear those 3. Okay. All those opposed to the honourable member moving the motion, please say nay. Nay. There you go. So we do not have a thing. The honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, as you well know, allowing exceptionally certain petitions in a timely manner to be presented is something that we do routinely. It's a courtesy that we offer to members of the House. We have a concurrence debate that has been moved. There's no doubt about that. But I would ask for unanimous consent to allow the member from Courtenay Alberni to table that petition that he has referenced and that the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs has asked him to present today.
No, I mean, we've had 2 no's already, so I don't. All right, so so you're just suggesting maybe just doing the one for Courtenay Alberni. Okay. All right. So I'm already hearing no's before we get, so I know we're not going to revisit it, but what I will suggest to the honourable members is that those can be tabled. They will be dated today as they were introduced into the House of Commons. So, Mr. Barlow, IP par Madame Rood, proposed.
Mr. Barlow, seconded by Ms. Rood, moves that the 10th report of the Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food, presented on Tuesday, June 13th, 2023, be concurred in. Debate.
Member for Foothills.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the time of my colleagues to allow me to discuss a study from the Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food, grocery affordability and examining rising food costs in Canada. And why I thought that was important to raise now, Mr. Speaker, and I do want to say I'll be splitting my time with the honourable member from Lambton, Kent, Middlesex, who has done a great deal of work on this subject specifically, and certainly the importance of the Grocery Code of Conduct, for example, to try and address food affordability issues for Canadian consumers. But, Mr. Speaker, why I feel it was important to discuss this study here today is certainly some information that has come out most recently regarding food inflation and food costs for Canadians. When we had completed this study in June of this past spring, there was some pretty difficult information for Canadian consumers to hear in there in terms of increasing costs and increasing questions and concerns around affordability for Canadians and their inability to feed their families. But that has become even more acute, Mr. Speaker, with the information that has come out recently regarding Canada's food report, which came out last week and revealed that in 2024, Canadian families will pay an additional $700 more for groceries than they did this previous year. So even the work that we had done on this initial study last spring is now almost out of date and obsolete, as food prices have continued to rise, and we see now that food inflation will go up again next year by between 5% and 7%, depending on the commodity that you are are purchasing. And we were waiting, as part of this study, we were waiting for additional report from Dalhousie University from Dr. Sylvain Charlebois, and Canadian consumers are going to be facing over the next 2 years. This comes at a time, Mr. Speaker, when we have about 2 million Canadians relying on a food bank every single month, when 1 in 5 Canadians are skipping meals because they can't afford to put food on the table. But I think the stats that we heard in this study are even more concerning. As part of this study, Mr. Speaker, we had testimony from Daily Bread Food Bank and Second Harvest. And their testimony said that due to the dire situation, according to their figures, food banks and other food-related programs across Canada served 5.1 million people per month last year. So I know we're talking about 2 million Canadians relying on a food bank every single month, but when you include other food insecurity programs like Second Harvest, that number goes to more than 5 million Canadians who are using a food security program or a charity like a food bank every single month. And now, as a result of the additional information that we have been provided, we are going to see higher food prices up to maybe 35%. So again, on testimony from the Daily Bread Food Bank and Second Harvest, they are expecting that the numbers to climb of those people who are using food banks and other food-related charities. They're expecting those numbers to climb to 8.2 million Canadians. That is roughly a 60% increase. Can you imagine, in a country like Canada, where we have the ability to not only feed our own residents but help feed the world, that because of inflationary policies and policies like the carbon tax, we could have more than 8 million Canadians relying on a regular basis on food banks and food charities to be able to feed their families? I find this to be unfathomable, Mr. Speaker, that in a country like Canada that we would be resorting to those types of numbers. And I hope everybody in this House would see those numbers to be absolutely shocking. So as Conservatives, we put forward a number of recommendations that we have last June asked the government to follow up on and try to address some of these concerning trends that we are seeing. And I would like to mention a couple of those recommendations that we put forward that I thought were quite specific and would go a great ways to address this crisis we are facing. Recommendation number 1, Mr. Speaker, was that the Government of Canada remove the carbon tax that is applied to all food inputs and production, including farm fuels and other aspects of the food supply system. That the Government of Canada complete an economic assessment and impact of the carbon tax and the Clean Fuel Standard, Carbon Tax 2, on how this increases both affect the cost of food production, the price of food, and food through the entire supply chain. And that the Government of Canada immediately reverse its policy on front-of-pack labeling. Now, the only thing that we missed there, Mr. Speaker, is I think we would have added a 4th recommendation had we known about it at the time. But now that we know the Liberal government is putting a ban on plastic food packaging, particularly for fresh fruit and vegetables, which will add an additional $8 million, or $8 billion with a B, on food costs. So between front-of-pack labeling and the new P2 plastics ban, and again, I want to really stress this point to everyone in the House and anybody who may be watching. This plastic ban isn't the single-use plastics ban that the government has now being forced to reverse because it's unconstitutional as a result of the decision at the court. This is another ban on plastics, and I want Canadians to picture this. As a result of this plastics ban on fresh fruit and vegetables, there will literally be the inability for Canadians to purchase products that they rely on, essential products that they purchase every day. Pre-packed salads, cucumbers, bananas. Many of these products are transported to Canada from outside of our country. You know, we don't grow bananas in our climate. We haven't quite gotten there in the greenhouse. But because of these plastic packaging rules, companies outside of Canada will not upend their systems to meet an incomprehensive rule that they don't want to meet and cannot meet. So Canadians will be going to the grocery stores and seeing empty grocery store shelves because we will no longer be able to import these products. But the secondary concern, as a result of front-of-pack labeling and this plastic ban, adding another $14 billion in costs on the food industry, Canadians are going to see skyrocketing food prices. So when you see the stats from Dr. Sylvain Charlebois with the carbon tax and other policies driving up food costs 34%, and now you add on these other layers of bureaucracy that's nonsensical, not based on science, the food and fresh produce industry said we just cannot meet this deadline that you are imposing upon us. And at the same time, the Liberal loyalists in the Senate did everything they could to kill Bill C-234, which would save Canadian farmers $1 billion by 2030 in the carbon tax. And we heard the Prime Minister in question period today basically questioning the carbon tax bills that farmers are sending us every single day, saying, I don't think they're being forthright on what their carbon tax numbers are. I think that's too high. Go out to every farm in Canada that is spending tens of thousands of dollars a month on carbon taxes to heat and cool their barns, dry their grains, or operate their family farms. These are the real-life consequences of this government's policies on carbon taxes and the impact that's happening on everyday Canadians and their inability to feed their families. So, Mr. Speaker, I thought it was very important that we had an opportunity to address this study that we tabled last June and try and update some of the numbers that were in this study that have now become obsolete as a result of the new data that's become available, that food prices are not only going up 5 to 7%, but as a result of the data and the studies that have been done, as a result of the Liberals' carbon tax and other punitive policy like front-of-pack labeling, like a ban on P2 plastics, Canadians are going to find it much more difficult to feed themselves, and millions more Canadians are going to be relying on food banks and charities. After 8 years, this Prime Minister is simply not worth the cost.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I heard the member across the way, the member from Foothills, indicate that the price on pollution is going to increase the cost of groceries by 34% over the next 2 years. I'm wondering if he could explain to the House how he can actually substantiate that fact.
The Honourable Member for Foothills.
I want to be clear, and I always appreciate the Honourable Member trying to put his own spin on things, but what I said was, as a result of a study by Dr. Sylvain Charlebois of Dalhousie University, these aren't numbers that I am picking out of the sky. I should almost try and find the quote for my Honourable Member from Winnipeg North, who this must drive him crazy to find out that there are actually numbers and we make decisions based on actual data. That as a result, he's forecasted that inflationary pressures and uncompetitive policies like the carbon tax on growing, processing, and transporting food will increase the cost of wholesale food by 34% on average for all food categories by 2025.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The Honourable Member for Cowichan Malahat Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do always appreciate the chance to speak about agriculture in the House. I am a little bit disappointed because I was hoping to speak to Bill C-58 today, but that being the case, my honourable colleague will know, given that he serves on the committee with me, that we are revisiting this issue and that we recently had 4 of the 5 grocery CEOs appear before our committee. Of course, in particular, Mr. Galen Weston tends to stand out. He's the one the media all seem to be interested about. What I found interesting when Mr. Weston appeared before our committee is that, number one, he doesn't seem to be aware of how many of his employees are accessing a food bank in order to get by. And this is a man who commands a benefits package that's worth about 431 times his average employee. But the point I really want to get to is that Mr. Weston's company, Loblaw, is one of the 2 holdouts on joining a grocery code of conduct. And I just want my honourable colleague to explain that to members of the House. If we have Walmart and Loblaw step out of the Grocery Code of Conduct, what is that going to do for the remaining players? And what does he think that the federal government, in partnership with the provinces, should take as a next step? Does he believe that it's time to start enforcing a mandatory code as a result?
The honourable member for Foothills.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I do appreciate the question from my colleague, and he is very right. He is correct. I was disappointed to see how the grocery CEOs were approaching the Grocery Code of Conduct, where you're seeing now Loblaws and Walmart pull out. The Grocery Code of Conduct and its voluntary mandate right now will not move ahead likely if not all of those main 5 grocery retailers sign on to that Grocery Code of Conduct. These grocery retailers need to start to take this seriously. And I think Canadians need to also understand the fees and fines that these retailers are burdening onto suppliers, producers, and processors across Canada that are driving up food costs and making life unaffordable for Canadian farmers. When we have 44% of produce growers in Canada operating at a loss, that's unsustainable. And a lot of that has to fall at the feet of those retailers who aren't doing their fair share.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Souris Mountain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his question, and I appreciate his speech and his comments to recognize the huge impact it's had on our agriculture industry. In my riding, which is the backbone of my riding, in keeping it producing, we see so many of my agriculture producers being challenged, whether it was because of a port strike in Vancouver and the restriction, the worries about possible port strike in Montreal, and those huge costs that are being put upon our farmers, which increase their costs. And as the member knows, that by increasing their costs and increasing the transportation costs, that's going to eventually increase the consumer's costs. And ultimately, that's going to put more people into the food bank. And I just wonder if the member would expand upon that.
The honourable member can expand on it in 30 seconds. The honourable member for Foothills.
Thank you very much to my colleague, who's always been a strong advocate for Canadian farmers and certainly his constituents in Saskatchewan. This is where I find the comments from the Prime Minister today in question period so offensive, where he said, farmers are not telling the truth about the cost of the carbon tax, and 97% of their carbon taxes are covered. That's completely false. Unlike most any other industry, Canadian farmers pay the carbon tax over and over and over again. To the rail lines when they transport their grain, to the trunking companies when they move their cattle, to the shipping companies when they're moving other commodities, when they're buying fertilizer, fuel, feed. They pay it every single time. And those prices and those increased costs are passed directly onto consumers.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Lambton, Kent, Middlesex.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm here today to talk about grocery affordability and examining rising food costs in Canada. And the Agriculture Committee submitted this report in June after a fairly lengthy study. And this has been a topic that's been near and dear to my heart for many years. Coming from a produce background and having a family farm in the produce business, feeding Canadians is something that my family has prided ourselves on for our entire lives, and it's been our livelihood. And making sure that we can sell an affordable product for Canadians so that Canadian families can go to the grocery store and afford to buy healthy, nutritious food at a reasonable cost is something that all farm producers want to see in this country. But unfortunately, we're at a time right now where we're not seeing that. And families are struggling. And I hear this on a daily basis. They're struggling to be able to afford the basic necessities. They're struggling to heat their homes. They're struggling to pay for their mortgages. But they're struggling to afford food. And recently I talked to someone from my community who runs one of the food banks in my community. And I asked him, I said, how has things been? Have you noticed an increase in the demand for food at the food bank? And he said, Leanne, we're so busy right now. I haven't even had the time to sit down and look at the numbers. The food, it just keeps coming, and people are showing up at my door and they want to have food. And he said, I hear from folks that I just need to come for this month, or I just need some food this week. I'll be okay in a couple of weeks. I just need a little bit right now. And he said, what I tell people is, You come to us as long as you need. I don't want you putting your money on your credit card. I don't want you racking up your credit card bills to be able to afford to eat. I want you to come here as much as you need, and I want you to pay off your bills. And we'll be here to support you to make sure that you can feed your family and your kids. And Mr. Speaker, that to me was very striking, because I never imagined in my lifetime living in Canada that I would see people suffering so bad to not be able to afford food to feed their families, especially when I know we produce some of the best food in the world, and we have access to fresh food here like we've never seen before. And one of the things that's making it expensive and more expensive for farmers to be able to produce their food is the carbon tax. And we did talk about it in this report. And I look at all of the steps that are taken along the journey for my farm in particular, and I can speak from experience. And when we see cost increases in the cost of fuel, it impacts what the cost of doing business is. And it's not just on the fuel that we use to bring the goods from the field into the warehouse, and then from a warehouse into the packing plant, and then from a packing plant to the food distribution centers. It's also all of the supplies that I get along the supply chain. And packaging is one area, Mr. Speaker, where I've noticed an increase over the years, especially during COVID, when there was a run for people to try to get packaging for their goods to sell to consumers, and consumers were eating more at home instead of eating at restaurants. And when the buying habits of consumers changed, it put a big demand on grocery stores and on producers to make sure we keep getting the goods to the grocery stores. And the price, the cost of packaging, partially because increased costs in the carbon tax to get that packaging to me and all the steps that it takes to make that packaging, but also because of demand for the packaging. And Mr. Speaker, the reason why I bring up the cost of packaging is because we've recently seen that the government has a new plastics ban proposed, not the first one that was struck down by the Supreme Court, but the second plastics package ban, the P2. And one of the recommendations in this report, Mr. Speaker, was to ensure the government's plastic reduction requirements are attainable by extending the implementation timeline for single-use plastics ban and working with retailers to ensure commercially viable alternatives to plastics, and in particular for packaging designed to extend the shelf life of food and limit food waste. And it needs to be available in the needed quantities. And I'd like to take a moment to educate those who may be watching at home right now. This plastics ban that's proposed on the fruit and vegetable industry is new. It's not the single-use plastics ban. And what consumers need to know is 2/3 of our fresh produce that we eat and consume in this country is imported from other countries. Well, we have a great area in Leamington where we grow a lot of vegetables in greenhouses, and every year we're seeing more and more production come online as far as greenhouse vegetable production. We are still reliant on most of our food coming as imports from other countries. And for the average person, you don't realize that before that food ever hits your grocery store shelves, it's on a ship coming from somewhere across the world, whether it's South America, whether it's South Africa, some comes from other parts of Africa, and a lot from South America. It sits in containers, refrigerated containers on ships going across the ocean to get to Canada, and then it has to be unloaded at a port and put on a truck, and the trucks have to come from sometimes in the United States and shipped up to Canada, and sometimes in through Montreal or sometimes through BC, but for the most part it comes through the US, and a lot of it comes into Toronto at the Ontario Food Terminal. And in order to keep vegetables and fruit fresh for its journey, which can be weeks on end before it ever sees a grocery store shelf, it needs to be in packaging that will be resilient and will also hold up the quality of the produce. And Produce is mostly water. It's just a fact of life. Fruit and vegetables are like water. And I don't know the exact percentage, it's like 90% or so. But if you're trying to ship water in the form of fruits and vegetables and try to keep it fresh to get on the grocery store shelves, it needs to be in something that's durable in order to preserve that freshness and the quality. And the number one consumed product in the world are bananas. And bananas have to be shipped in plastic in order to stop them from ripening en route so that we can ripen them once they get into the country. And if this new plastics ban goes ahead, we won't see bananas on the shelves anymore. In fact, the U.S. has said already, and some of the suppliers have said that if the plastics ban on produce goes forth in Canada, we won't be seeing things on the shelves like bagged salads, all the pre-made things, the pre-cut veggies, pre-cut fruit. You're not going to see your berries in the clamshells. Grapes come in bags. Potatoes come in some plastic bags. And it's there for a reason, to keep it fresh so that it can stay in your home so you have time to consume it before it goes bad. And if this ban goes through, we're going to see huge amounts of food waste, huge, which is going to increase greenhouse gas emissions. We're going to see up to 50% food waste. And the greenhouse gases will double, actually, the emissions from food waste. This will have a catastrophic impact on our food security in this country. So not just talking about the affordability for Canadians, but we're talking food security now because of the NDP Liberal government's own policies that are creating this scenario. And Mr. Speaker, I just want to touch also on the carbon tax. And I have some folks in my riding who've written to me recently to talk about those increases to the costs in their production that they're not able to recoup. They're grain farmers. And one grain farmer reached out to tell me that their gas bill last month for drying their corn was $39,000. That's just for 1 month. And the carbon tax portion of that was $10,000. $10,000 for 1 month, and that farmer will never be able to recoup that $10,000. They won't be able to put it back into their business so that they can innovate and make sure that they're doing what they can to help the environment. And I have a chicken farmer who gave me his gas bills for the whole year, and he's paying $15,000 in carbon taxes this year just to heat one barn. So, Mr. Speaker, this government's own policies, whether it's the plastics ban, the new plastics ban, whether it's the carbon tax, it's creating unaffordable food for Canadians. And this government should be doing more to make sure that Canadians can afford to feed themselves in the form of changing their policies, axing the carbon tax, and helping, and Canadians know that Conservatives will axe the carbon tax. We will make life more affordable for Canadians, because after 8 years of this Prime Minister, he's just not worth the cost.
Excellent.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Fleetwood Port Kells.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if the honourable member, and I'm just actually going based on some input from the chap behind me here, I wonder if she knows how long Europe has gone without bananas, because Europe does not allow things to be shipped in wrapped in plastic, or if it is shipped in with plastic, there's a penalty to be paid. But also, whether or not she's heard of the Nabob Coffee Company out my way in British Columbia. When you get those pods, they look like they have a plastic ring, and it looks like they're in a plastic bag, but that plastic is actually made from vegetable matter, and it's entirely compostable. So that works. Can she comment on that?
The honourable member for Lambton Kent Middlesex.
Thank you to my colleague for his great question. And the answer to that is there actually is no commercially viable option at this point to the plastic packaging that's available right now. And it's a global supply chain. It's not just Canada that we're working with the globe. We're buying, like I said, we import 2/3 of our fresh food in this country from other countries. And if there was a commercially viable option at this time, I'm sure that the retailers and farmers and anybody that needed to package the produce would be using it. But because we're a global supply chain and we rely on 2/3 of our food to be imported, it means those countries that we import from also have to be on board with this. And if there was an option, an alternative that was globally available at a good cost, because again, we don't want to do things that are going to increase the cost for Canadians, but I know farmers, I know the industry is working very hard to be able to find those alternatives, and we heard that from the grocers themselves as well. We're looking for alternatives, they're just not there yet, and once they're there, we'll make sure that, I'm sure industry will make sure that they'll be doing all they can to implement that.
Question et commentaires, questions and comments. The honourable member for Cowichan, Malahat, Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague will be aware that earlier this week, Dr. Jim Stanford was one of our witnesses, and he's provided our committee with a brief that derives its information from publicly available data. On page 5 of that brief, Mr. Speaker, he noted that from the beginning of 2021 to the spring of 2022, the world price of oil tripled from $40 a barrel to $120 a barrel. And that in that period, the jump in the price of oil, which was driven by a combination of geopolitics and speculation, increased fossil fuel prices by 30 times as much as the $10 carbon price increase in the same period. We also know from previous briefs that in the last 3 years, oil and gas companies have seen their net profit go up by over 1,000%. So my question to you, through you, Mr. Speaker, to my honourable colleague is, why when the Conservatives are talking about the carbon tax, why do they conveniently ignore these facts and ignore their very real role in driving up food price inflation? Because you can't argue with the facts. This is clear data that's available for all members, and oil profits have had a huge impact on world food prices, far more than the carbon tax has. Will my colleague acknowledge that?
The honourable member for Lambton Kent Middlesex.
I'd like to thank my colleague for his comments. I always enjoy working with my colleague on the Agriculture Committee, and we've worked really hard together on the Code of Conduct, which, Mr. Speaker, I didn't get a chance to talk about the Code of Conduct yet, but for the last several years I've been a huge supporter of getting a Code of Conduct in place, and this week we heard that Loblaws and Walmart have no intention at this point of signing the code that's before them right now, but we have all the other retailers on board. And what the Code of Conduct is going to do is make it easier and better for farmers and suppliers who generally face steep fines and fees that they have to pay just for the privilege of selling their goods on grocery store shelves. And that also contributes to higher grocery prices when farmers have to find a way to recoup the cost in the form of the fees and fines that they pay to retailers for selling their goods. So I would encourage and I hope that we can see the Grocery Code of Conduct ratified and see all parties sign on to it to make sure that we can treat our farmers, our suppliers fairly so that they can continue to supply nutritious food to Canadians.
Time for une petite question.
Time for a brief question.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie ma collègue pour son...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for her speech. Unfortunately, she is not answering the question. My colleague for the NDP asked about the exorbitant profits, scandalous, stratospheric profits from oil companies, which have an extremely significant impact on the cost of food. I would like us to talk about the profits of oil companies. I hope she heard the question, Mr. Speaker. We have almost no time left.
A member from Lambton Kent Middlesex to finish up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to my colleague. I always a pleasure to work with him as well. But the reality is, Mr. Speaker, it's the government policies that are increasing food costs, and part of it is the carbon tax. When families are going to have to pay an additional $700 next year to feed their families, they already can't afford food right now, and they're going to have to pay another $700 to feed their families. And Mr. Speaker, Conservatives believe that families should be able to keep more money in their pockets, and we will axe the carbon tax to help them have more affordable food.
Pursuant to Standing Order 38, it is my duty to inform the House that the questions to be raised tonight at the time of adjournment are as follows. 1. Honourable Member for Beauce. Carbon pricing.
Dinah for York on Indigenous Affairs, and the Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre on climate change. Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as I've said in the past, it's always a pleasure to be able to rise and address the House. You know, obviously there is no surprise whatsoever in terms of what's taking place today. It's interesting. On Monday, I was actually standing up and I was being critical of the Conservative Party. Hard to believe, Mr. Speaker, but I was being critical of the Conservative Party. Why? Because they had brought in a concurrence report, Mr. Speaker. And the concurrence report was to talk about Afghanistan, foreign affairs. Now, by doing that particular concurrence report, Mr. Speaker, what they prevented was government legislation from being able to actually being debated. Interesting enough, Mr. Speaker, the legislation that they prevented from being debated, where members could have stood up and talked about, was Bill C-56, the affordability legislation, Mr. Speaker. Every word that the Conservative Party has actually said already this afternoon could have been said during that debate, Mr. Speaker. And that's why I argued back then, as I will argue today, that the Conservative Party is very much out of touch with the realities and what Canadians are actually facing, and they are more concerned about how it is that they can cater to the extreme right, Mr. Speaker. And we hear the term MAGA conservatives. And I would suggest to you that it is becoming more and more something in which all Canadians should be very much aware of it. Because it is something that is creeping out, coming from the South. It's that Donald Trump Make America Great Again theme, the Donald Trump theme, and the catering to the far right there that's coming up.
The Honourable Member for Simcoe Grey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just been listening here, and I don't really see a whole lot of relevance in what's being said. Once again, it's kind of ridiculous what we're hearing.
I just want to make sure that we don't get too many points of order come up, that I make sure that when people are talking about the points of order that they bring up, that they actually quote out of that great book that we're all given when we first get here. But I will also say that we are speaking to a concurrence report, the Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
That's right. And Mr. Speaker, if the member takes the time to actually read the report that was brought forward in the form of a concurrence motion, he'll find out that it's about affordability. And that is, in fact, how I started my comments, talking about the issue of affordability in Bill C-56, the Affordability Act, and how that legislation was being filibustered by the Conservatives through a concurrence motion, Mr. Speaker. And the reason why is because they do not care about the issues of the day that Canadians are concerned about, because, and then I started to explain it. Now, maybe all members on the other side don't fully understand it, because they're following the lead that's coming from the leader of the Conservative Party's office, Mr. Speaker, and that House leadership team that is over there. And I think that Canadians have a right to know that the pattern that we are witnessing in terms of the behavior and the issues that are being brought up and the manner in which they are being brought up definitely deals with the issue of MAGA politics. The member across the way might disagree with it, Mr. Speaker. Maybe he should talk to his leader, and his leader can explain to him exactly what the Conservative agenda really is. Because when you think of affordability, think in terms of what the member from Foothills said, Mr. Speaker. He tries to give this impression, the cost of food and inflation. He cites the report, and he says 34% increase in the next couple of years. And then he tries to say, well, this is a report that I'm kind of quoting from, Mr. Speaker. I'll tell you what the Conservatives are very, very good at. the same thing that Donald Trump is very good at, Mr. Speaker, and that is sending out information that is misleading. And I'm being very kind when I say that, Mr. Speaker. I could think of a lot of other words to use, so I'm being generous. And let me suggest the reason why. Think about it. He's trying to plant the seeds of fear that the price on pollution is costing huge amounts of money on the issue of inflation, on food inflation. And the members across the way, some of them actually believe the leader of the Conservative Party, Mr. Speaker. I understand there's an obligation to listen to the leader because, after all, he is your leader. But just because he's your leader doesn't mean you have to believe everything he says. Because he is, Mr. Speaker, he's like, what do they call it? One of those oil sales, I don't want to get into personalities, Mr. Snake oil salesperson. Well, Mr. Speaker, think about this. Think in terms of...
I've got a point of order from the honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's well known in this place that we don't refer to honourable members as snake oil salesmen or other negative things. I think all honourable members here, if they're going to debate, should debate and use either the name of their title or the name of their riding. I just don't think that's parliamentary language. That's right. And I think the members should maybe dwell upon that, our rules a little bit more.
The Speaker was clear in his report that we should be referring to one another by our proper titles, which is, of course, by our riding names. Are we still on the same point of order? Okay, nope. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Yes. Mr. Speaker, you know, the other day when I was up, I couldn't believe the number of times the Conservatives stood up on a point of order. I think they stretched out my 20-minute speech. They almost doubled down on the length of the speech because of the number of interruptions. And why were they interrupting back then, Mr. Speaker? They were interrupting because I was telling people that were following the debates how the Conservatives were actually voting, Mr. Speaker. And they took offense that I had said that they do not support Ukraine and they constantly vote against Ukraine. So they are up one after another, saying, well, no, you can't tell Canadians how we vote, Mr. Speaker. The point is as sensitive as the Conservative membership might be inside the House, the leadership of the House is actually sending messages that is very much misleading. And let me use the specific example that has already been brought up by a number of members today. They say, you know, the issue of the price on pollution, Mr. Speaker. And it doesn't matter how many times I say this, they just ignore the facts and the reality. And here is the facts, something that they cannot deny. You know, I'll go to University of Winnipeg with an intro course or a second-year program or any high school in the north end of Winnipeg, and I'll sit down with the students if there's a Conservative member that has the courage to sit alongside me and say and have that discussion with me. And I'll talk about the facts, and let's see what they have to say, Mr. Speaker. Because here is the facts. The price on pollution also provides a rebate. And for 80% plus of Canadians, they actually get more money back than they actually pay into the price on pollution, Madam Speaker, or Mr. Speaker. That is actually a fact. The Conservatives don't understand it, Mr. Speaker, or are they misleading it? Because when the leader of the Conservative Party travels the country and says, I am going to get rid of the price on pollution, what he doesn't tell them is that he's also going to be getting rid of the rebate, Mr. Speaker. And by getting rid of the rebate, he is going to hurt the average Canadian, the middle-class Canadian, Mr. Speaker, and those aspiring to be a part of it, and those that need the break the most. That's the money he is taking away, Mr. Speaker. That is the reality. But you know what? It doesn't prevent him from touring the country and telling people that it's going to be, if I get rid of this price on pollution, life is going to be more affordable for Canadians. That's just not true, Mr. Speaker. It's not true. But like Donald Trump, he'll say things that are not true. It's that Magna right element that's out there that's very real, that the Conservative Party of Canada is courting, Mr. Speaker, in a very big way, and they're prepared to sacrifice sound public policy in order to be able to capture that and have that support base be a part of the Conservative Party, Mr. Speaker. And it's unfortunate, because at the end of the day, people are concerned about our environment. Unlike the Conservatives, who still, in good part, deny climate issues are real. They don't believe in climate change, in good part, at least publicly they don't, on their public policies, Mr. Speaker. So when they talk about we're going to make life more affordable by getting rid of the price on pollution, let me give you a reminder. The Governor of the Bank of Canada. We all remember the Governor, right? The Governor is the individual that runs the Bank of Canada. He's the one that the leader of the Conservative Party wanted to fire, Mr. Speaker. We remember that? He wanted to fire him. But then there was an issue in which he kind of agreed with the Governor of the Bank of Canada, so he's kind of watered down that position. The member from Abbotsford was told, don't tell me what to say type of thing, and I don't know, some sort of a demotion of sorts, but I won't go into that, Mr. Speaker. That's all internal Conservative politics. But I can tell you this, last I could tell, is the Conservative Party of Canada today seems to be a little bit more sympathetic to the Bank of Canada. And what did the Governor actually say? He says that when you think of the price on pollution and the impact on inflation, now get this, Mr. Speaker, as one Conservative member tries to give the impression of 30+ percentage points, 34 has been corrected from a member opposite, Mr. Speaker. So as the Conservatives want to give that bit of false information, what does the Governor of the Bank of Canada say? You're talking point. That's a decimal 1/5 of 1%, Madam Speaker, or Mr. Speaker. In my books, that makes the Conservative Party an absolute joke. There makes no sense, Mr. Speaker, whatsoever for the Conservative Party to try to tell Canadians that by cutting out the price on pollution, life is going to be more affordable to Canadians. The MAGA right might believe that, Mr. Speaker, and they'll be talking about that at great lengths over the Christmas break until we come back. They're going to continue that spin as if the price on pollution is what's driving up inflation, Mr. Speaker. And nothing could be further from the truth. You would think that would change their behavior. But don't bank on it, Mr. Speaker, because it will not. Because they're more concerned about that simple phrase so that they can put it onto a bumper sticker, Mr. Speaker. And that's unfortunate because it is sound public policy. Think of the consequence of it. When they're talking about affordability, Mr. Speaker, think in terms of what is impacting the price of our groceries. One of the major factors is what's taking place in the world. For example, the war that's taking place in Europe. Russia has invaded Ukraine. There was a time in which every member of Parliament stood as one in recognizing that we had to be there for Ukraine. What you saw is the world, in good part, recognizing the importance of Ukraine solidarity, Mr. Speaker. And what we have witnessed is the MAGA Conservatives, over the last number of weeks, adopt the position that we do not support the Canada-Ukraine trade agreement, Mr. Speaker. Think about that just for a moment. We have had so many trade agreements. Was it 35, 40 trade agreements, Mr. Speaker? No government, no prime minister or government in Canada has signed more trade agreements than this current Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. No government in the history of Canada. And it was nice. The Conservative Party supported every one of them. Even when they were in government, they brought in trade agreements. Why? Because they realized that it's in Canada's best interest. It provides more marketplaces, and it provides more competition. More competition means better prices. The very first time I've witnessed the Conservative Party vote against a trade agreement was the Canada-Ukraine trade agreement, Mr. Speaker. I do not understand how it is that they can justify that sort of a position. That is not going to make life more affordable here in Canada. So when the members opposite talk about affordability, how do they justify their MAGA behavior dealing with the Ukraine-Canada trade agreement, Mr. Speaker? And now they're out there again trying to spread all sorts of information. They're saying, well, you know what, we support Ukraine. Do you see the members on standing orders, standing up, SO31s, standing up saying, oh, how we support Ukraine, how we support Ukraine? Well, Mr. Speaker, if they supported Ukraine, they would be supporting affordable grocery prices, more affordable grocery prices, especially in the long run, Mr. Speaker. But then why did they vote against the Canada-Ukraine deal? Why did they vote not once, twice, but at least on 3 separate occasions, Mr. Speaker, during a line-by-line breakdown of expenses that the government is actually spending money on? On 3 occasions, they intentionally voted that money down, Mr. Speaker. And yet they say, well, we support Ukraine. Actions speak louder than words. And, you know, I would encourage my Conservative friends opposite to reflect on the flip-flop they made on the price on pollution. You know, they say the price on pollution is going to make life more affordable. We know that's not true, Mr. Speaker, but that's what they say. In the last federal election, they didn't say that. In the last federal election, they were in support of a price on pollution, but they took a flip-flop, Mr. Speaker, and now they don't support a price on pollution. And it is marginal, like you're talking a fraction point, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the impact on the inflation rate on groceries. Now, I would like to see them taken what I would classify as an honorable flip-flop. An honorable flip-flop would be to recognize that the MAGA right is wrong and get behind Ukraine and get behind what the government, the Liberals, the New Democrats, and you know what, the New Democrats, they rarely vote for trade agreements, but they even see the benefits of this trade agreement, Mr. Speaker. The Bloc and the Green, they're the only political entity that are voting against it, Mr. Speaker. They're the only political entity that voted against the line-by-line expenditures. That has more of an impact on long-term grocery prices than their price on pollution idea. So I would encourage over the next number of weeks as they go and talk to their constituents that they reconsider the way in which they have been behaving inside the House and look in terms of the benefits of how legislation and budgetary measures that the government is actually taking that will make life more affordable, and start voting for some of those initiatives, such as the dental plan that we just announced that is going to literally help millions of Canadians, such as the grocery rebate that was given by the government that helped, I believe, 9 or 11 million Canadians, Mr. Speaker, by supporting the child care program that we've made for $10 a day, a truly national program. By the way, that's a program that they called a slush fund in the last federal election, Mr. Speaker. Shame. These are the types of actions that if the Conservative Party would abandon the MAGA right, that in fact we would have better public policy that would be in the best interests of Canadians and make life more affordable. This is a government that will continue day in and day out to look at ways to ensure that life is as affordable as it possibly can be by using good, sound government policy. We would look to the opposition, in particular the Conservative Party, to recognize those facts, and there's nothing wrong with supporting the types of initiatives that the government is bringing forward to provide the breaks that Canadians want. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Here, what a great speech.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, the member opposite certainly tried to summon up every boogeyman he could think of, but Canadians actually are seeing in their pocketbooks that they can't afford to buy groceries, that they can't afford to pay their heating bills. They're seeing the carbon tax line. I get calls at my office all the time about it. And so I'm sure that the member opposite is getting the same kind of calls from people that are concerned about the increasing cost of groceries and the increasing cost of the carbon tax on everything. Is he not receiving those calls?
Honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know if the member heard the governor of the Bank of Canada says that the price on pollution, or the carbon tax, that's what the Conservatives like to label it on the bumper stickers, actually is going to cost decimal, that's a 0.15%. So decimal 1.5 of 1%. That is a far cry in terms of what the Conservative Party of Canada is trying to spread throughout the country, which is exceptionally misleading. And Canadians want a government that actually has a climate plan. Because unlike the Conservative Party of Canada, most Canadians recognize that climate change is real. So there is an expectation of leadership, Mr. Speaker, and they are seeing it with this government in terms of a number of policy points that we have enunciated in order to be able to ensure that there's a higher sense of affordability. And when you want to talk about inflation rates overall, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest to you, and I'll get to that point in my next question. Thank you.
Thank you. La question commentaire, l'honorable député.
The honourable member for Berthier-Masquinongé. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if my colleague realizes that the hot air coming from the industry minister served no purpose. And I'm not sure if he's been following the Agriculture Committee's work, but the CEO of Metro appeared this week and he frankly admitted, and I congratulate him on his candor, he said to Minister Champagne that he would continue doing what he'd always been doing, which is offering the best possible prices to customers. So they weren't going to change their practices at all. They were going to sign the code of conduct, and in his opinion, that had nothing to do with prices. It wouldn't change prices at all. And there are other CEOs, like the Loblaws CEO, who said that he wouldn't even sign the code. So my question is about the whole media operation by the industry minister opposite. I wonder if the parliamentary secretary realizes all that. The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think it's something in which it's just the government of Canada. I know other provincial jurisdictions. I know, and I can attest, that it's actually the people of Canada that are exceptionally upset in regards to the Big Five groceries. And there is an expectation that we all try to do something in regards to holding them to more account. That's why, whether it was the Prime Minister or the Minister of Industry that's made reference to, calling them to Ottawa, making sure that we are expressing and being a voice to the 40 million Canadians to let them know that things such as the grocery conduct, that is something that's really important to all of us, to all of Canadians. And there will, in fact, be a cost to pay, ultimately, Mr. Speaker. And I would hope that we would see a whole lot more respect and, more importantly, more action coming from the Big Five grocery chains. And there is no way, under no circumstances, would I ever suggest that the Minister or the Prime Minister not do what they have been doing in terms of trying to hold those corporations to account.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Courtenay Alberni.
Why are we having this concurrence debate? We know why, because the Conservatives don't want us to be debating anti-scab legislation. They say they're here for workers. They're not here for workers. They moved this concurrence motion so that we couldn't talk about protecting workers' rights. That's exactly why we're having this concurrence debate. But while we're here, let's talk about food prices. And I come from a coastal community, Mr. Speaker, and as you know, coming from a coastal community yourself, people rely on local fisheries. Wild salmon, for example, where I live, which is critical to food security. But when it comes to going to the grocery store, it's pretty sad, Mr. Speaker, when Galen Weston earns 431 times what his employees earn. When we see corporate taxes under the Conservatives and Liberals go from 28% to 15%. Mr. Speaker. And then we have employees for these companies going to the food bank. So my question through you to my colleague, does his party, will they consider revisiting the corporate tax rate? Or are they going to continue the corporate welfare that's going on while their employees are going to the food bank, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the member raised two issues, and I want to address the first issue that he raised, because I, too, and I've had the opportunity to speak on the anti-scab legislation. We have heard now for I don't know how long where the Conservative Party tries to say that they're a party to support the workers, and they have not been able to clearly demonstrate that, Mr. Speaker. Today, we weren't supposed to be having this concurrence report. This debate today was supposed to be about anti-scab legislation. Again, very much a progressive piece of legislation that we made a promise in the last election. It was a part of the Liberal Party election platform to bring in anti-scab legislation. And what we're witnessing is a Conservative Party using legislative tactics, again, for the I don't know how many times. I don't think there's been a opposition party that has used it as much as this opposition party, in order to frustrate the legislative agenda. So whether it's the issue of affordability, whether it's the issue of workers, and so many other things, that the government continues to be focused on being there for Canadians, as the Conservative Party of Canada is more focused on being a destructive force here on the floor of the House of Commons and playing party politics more so than what's good, sound public policy.
Questions and comments. Question commentaire. The Honourable Member for Mississauga East Cooksville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are close to 60 countries in the world that have a price on pollution. You got Canada, you've got the whole European Union, 27 countries. You got Denmark, Japan, Korea, Mexico, New Zealand, Norway, Singapore, Sweden, the UK, many more, and Ukraine.
I'm being heckled here. I'm being heckled because I didn't recognize someone. And I just want to say is that the Honourable Member for Mississauga East Cooksville had stood up before the Honourable Member came to visit us. So I'm just going to say that. So the Honourable Member for Mississauga East Cooksville has the floor.
Thank you.
From the top.
So thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, there are close to 60 countries in the world that have a price on pollution. We're talking, of course, Canada. We've got Denmark, the whole European Union, 27 countries, Japan, Korea, Mexico, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, Singapore, Sweden, UK. I could say many more. Ukraine. And, of course, we have trade agreements with many of these countries. We've had long-standing trade agreements. We have voted in this House as Liberals for a free trade agreement with Canada, Ukraine. The Conservatives, in their reckless and risky way, I'm asking the member for Winnipeg North, would that put many of our trade agreements around the world in jeopardy?
The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Mr. Speaker, one of the countries that the member missed is that there are many states in the United States that actually have a price on pollution, and I suspect it's only going to be a question of time before the United States will, in fact, have a price on pollution. Because, as I say, there are many states currently that do. What's really important for us to recognize, because, again, the price on pollution makes a lot of sense as countries around the world are adopting it, including the European Union, and that's one of the reasons why Ukraine has had it since 2011. And that's why it's totally amazing. You've got to ask yourself the question, why does the Conservative Party continuously vote against Ukraine, specifically the Canada-Ukraine trade agreement? There is only one answer, and that answer is it's the MAGA right of the United States that is creeping into Canada via the leader of the official opposition's office, who wants to be the golden boy advertising and misleading, the Donald Trump of the North, as one of my colleagues would say. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, I just want to say it'd be great if everybody could keep their questions and comments as short as possible so everyone can get to participate in this great debate. But we're going to move on to the next speaker, the Honourable
The Honourable Member for Berthier-Mesquite-Norgich. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Listen. Sorry, just 1 second. There's a point of order from the Honourable Minister for Tourism. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions will be answered today. Q 1945, 1950, 1953 to 1955, 1943, 1944, 1946 to 1949, 1951, 1952, and 1956. Thank you, Mr. President.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. The Honourable Member for Berthier-Mesquite-Norgich. From the top. So, as is my habit, I will actually talk about the subject of the debate, which is surprising. This is a report from the Agriculture and Agri-Food Committee. I don't follow the comments stating that the Conservative Party is filibustering, doing systematic obstruction. On the other hand, we have a government who gives us excellent speeches, but with few results thereafter, which is rather ironic. And then we have the NDP that votes for the government, irrespective of what's in the bill. But we're here to speak about the substance of the matter, to speak about content, and so I'm going to talk about content. In the recommendations we made, we studied the cost of groceries, which allows me to give more specifics following my question to the Parliamentary Secretary. The Minister for Industry's operation did absolutely nothing. It was just a great communications operator which sought to increase their polling numbers, which has also failed, by the by. CEOs had already been invited at committee, and at committee we'd already tasted the, shall I say, the temerity when it comes to listening aptly to what we said. When these 5 CEOs turned up at committee, they didn't want to give us the astronomical profit margins that significantly increased year on year, despite what they were saying. They're saying, well, we're in competition with other grocery chains, so we can't give you these numbers. But Mr. Speaker, I asked them, are you going to give it to the Competition Bureau? The information would therefore be kept secret. 5 of them promised to do so, but when I received the report, in the first page, it is said that nothing was actually offered by the company. No information was given by these companies, which is great for transparency. The Minister for Industry kind of asked them to do it once again. The government trying to get people to think that the government is doing anything. And the grocery chain said, well, I gave these numbers. 5 CEOs had promised to give us the numbers. The Competition Bureau said they had not received these numbers. And then the 5 CEOs after said, well, we've given them the numbers. That's the power of this government when it comes to fighting against high grocery prices. The issue goes deeper than this. The problem is private. It goes beyond private businesses. It goes into the world of competition. We have an oligopoly where we have 5 companies that control 80% of the market. Even if they claim to not talk to one another, which, well, sometimes we have doubts about this, but we can't accuse without proof. Even if they don't talk to one another, they keep an eye on each other. After COVID, they eliminated every single one of them eliminated bonuses at the same day, which is a bit suspicious. When it comes to price fixing, well, the prices are very similar from one chain to the next, and that's the issue. The issue, Madam Speaker, I'm pleased that you have just entered to enjoy the rest of my speech. Madam Speaker, this oligopoly is also present in the oil and gas industry. And our Conservative friends who denounce the carbon tax, well, I understand that this has an impact on some of the country. Beyond that, the issue is the increase in profits for oil and gas, which is strange because the Conservatives have yet to denounce this. My NDP colleagues have denounced grocery profits, and I understand that. Yes, that's all fair and good. I do agree that they are too big, these profits. So why don't we hear the Conservatives talk about oil and gas profits? We're being told that people need to spend more for their oil and for their fuel, for example, for their gas. I asked the same question twice to my colleague, my Conservative colleague, asking why they've said nothing about oil profits and the increase in prices. Perhaps they would like to answer today. What we need is transparency. There needs to be competition, Madam Speaker. We asked that information be provided on price fixing. We asked that more flexibility be given to Indigenous communities, for example, up north, where food is horribly more expensive than elsewhere in Canada. We could implement measures to fight against food waste. We could revisit best buy dates. I went to a yogurt factory and I talked to them about best before dates, and I told the head of production as follows. I said that even if the best buy date was the 3rd of November, I'd still enjoy my yogurt on the 4th of November, and I was fine. Perhaps there could be a bit more flexibility on that front, therefore. We could find ways to redistribute food surpluses. There's a farmer that told me when my farm machinery goes through my fields, there is still some food that's left behind. And so volunteers could go afterwards and get this surplus. This happens in pockets of the country. It doesn't happen throughout Canada. We could therefore, perhaps as a country, compensate the costs for farmers and producers if they do this themselves and then give it to food banks. This could be an idea. Because farmers have generosity in their blood. Why should farmers and producers pay for this operation? They already work all day. They get very little support. They are ignored by the government. My colleague for Abitibi-Témiscamingue was accompanied here by producers of his region. They met the minister to explain what is happening in their region, to explain the lack of support, the lack of programs for producers. Farmers and producers are being abandoned. And then we wonder why food has gone up after all of this. There is a certain lack of logic. Can we perhaps, for once, take care of farmers and producers? Madam Speaker, we've spoken about plastics today. We are for protecting the environment, of course. We want plastics to be removed from circulation, but we have to do it in an intelligent way. It's like with pesticides. We have to figure out what will be its replacement, what the impact will be. Is the solution going to be worse than what is being removed? When a pesticide becomes more popular than another, governments turn to populism to decide what to ban and what not to ban. I'm not saying that accusing certain parties of populism is wrong. What I want to say is that let us not fall into this blaming game. In this report that we're discussing today, there was another recommendation, that the government reimburse farmers and producers that paid the 35% tax on Russian fertilizer. This never happened, and it won't happen. Why? Because the government doesn't know who paid what and how much and to whom. And so the tax has remained, and we're the only country that's done that. Everyone wants to help Ukraine, of course, but we could be intelligent as well in this operation. Our producers pay the tax on imported products that are here anyway, and the government isn't able to give them the money back. The government says, don't worry, we'll invest in climate change and against climate change. And producers should apparently be happy about this new program. And then people say groceries are expensive. Once again, I have non-parliamentary words that come to mind on the matter, but I must keep that within me and not share them with this House. We've spoken about this program. Now, I want to talk about liquidity, which is an issue. Agri-food, which we should never forget. There's agriculture, but then there's also agri-food. There's processing, there's the preparation of foods. It's a very complex beast, Madam Speaker. In the report, we asked as follows. Could we allow SMEs to have better access to liquidity so they can survive? The government, all it does is sometimes lend them money, but there is no direct support. There's a simple piece of support that could have been done, and I would like to hear my Conservatives talk about this a bit more often. An emergency fund for companies and the reimbursement of the loans that were given under this program. This could be a tangible help, but the Conservatives have been very silent about this. Why don't they support us? Asking this government to say, could another year be given, especially to farmers and producers, for the reimbursement of the loans? I'm sure that there are farmers and producers in every riding that have said, well, I can't reimburse my loan now. I really need an extra year. The government says, how's about 18 days? Otherwise, you could take another loan with current interest rates at 7 to 9% to pay your old loan. Otherwise, I'm so generous, they say, I'll take away your subsidies. That's generosity, but under a different name. I might seem annoyed, if not angry, but it feels like I'm just repeating the same thing over and over and over again. The whip laughed when I said, when I was told, you need to talk about agriculture. And I'll say, yes, send me this. I'll look at the recommendations of this report, and I'll talk to this. But it seems to be the same report that we talked about last week at the Standing Committee. We work very hard, we work very seriously to make good recommendations. But now, 6 months later, nothing has been done, and we have the same situation. But we have to make the same recommendations because nothing was done the first time. There are many recommendations in this report that have been proposed over the past 4 years. Could the government finally act on them? Liquidity for SMEs, emergency accounts, those are two subjects that have not been acted upon, which is a scandal. The government accepts to sit by the sideline while our SMEs are failing, while our SMEs are insolvent. They want to draw blood from a stone, and the stone will be in the shape of bankruptcy. For the past 4 years, we've made recommendations regarding investment funds for modernizing infrastructure in agriculture. This is what we saw when we had a look at the supply chain, is that we saw that our businesses in Canada and Quebec are severely underfunded when it comes to infrastructure and technology. When investments are kicked down the line, at the end of the day, it's just cheaper to not update and simply just start from scratch. Maple Leaf was a good example. They simply packed up and went to the States. Can we be constructive for once? It doesn't have to be expensive, but let us just update things rather than have to wait to renew them completely. We also talked about the Competition Bureau and giving more powers to that body. This, so that it may be able to compel companies to provide the statistics that they were asked to. The Competition Bureau should also stop just approving everything. We're being told that a company could be granted a 30% market share, but what does that mean? There would be 3 companies that would control nearly everything. Since the 80s, there have been mergers after mergers after mergers. And what's funny is that not a single political leader had the forethought to say, oh, this market might be too concentrated. There will be too few actors controlling too many things and fixing prices. It's only after the fact that 5 companies control 80% of the companies. And now they're being summoned and saying, hey, let's put some special deals in your weekly flyers. And then they expect Canadians to say, well, that's great. But I think the Canadians won't have the wool pulled over their eyes anymore, Madam Speaker. Why are there only 5 companies? What are the barriers into the market? What are the competitivity practices that exist in this sector? It should be illegal to ban other grocery stores from opening close to a first one that's already there. Some people have a 5-year ban on opening a new grocery store, and then we're being told, oh, there's not enough competition. It's like labor. It's not a surprise. It's not a surprise. There's no labor. But again, it's done after the fact. And then it's a panic. Well, the Liberal government doesn't even say that. They say, oh, there's not enough labor. They say, let's just wait. They stick their heads in the sand. They wait, and they wait. 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and all of a sudden, they wake up. Oh, well, it hasn't fixed itself, so let's maybe do something. The government has to act for Canadians. And that's the message I have. My message is also for the Conservatives that are just blocking things for the sake of blocking things. They seem to be having great fun. But I'm also aiming my words to the Liberal government. They need to listen to the opposition. I also would like to talk to the NDP. Don't just vote for anything that Liberals throw at you just because you might have a little bit of a bonus in the shape of a program or another. We need to work in the common interest, everyone together. Madam Speaker, it's not the first time I'm saying this in the House. Elections should last 1.5 months maximum, with 4 years between every election. We need to work together for the common good. And to show this, Madam Speaker, I will end 4 minutes before the end of my time, and I hope that my colleague from the Agriculture Committee will enjoy the fact that I'm doing that, even though I haven't left a lot of time after me. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Fleetwood Portgals.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Appreciated the honourable member's comments. Can you comment on the fact that a business, say a trucking company that moves food, they pay a price on pollution, they pay a carbon tax, but they get a rebate, and as an input cost, they also get to deduct that from the amount that they earn as a company. So really, does that not, in the member's opinion, really negate the argument that somehow a price on pollution is behind high food prices today?
Honorable député de Berthier-Masquinongé.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Well, listen, thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my colleague for the question. And I want to seize the opportunity to say that in Quebec, we're less familiar with your carbon tax because we don't do that. We have our own system, same as that used in California. According to the numbers that I've seen, the carbon tax is responsible for 0.15% of the inflation we're currently experiencing. And most of the inflation we're seeing is because of oligopolies that are enjoying scandalous profits. And it's not just grocery chains, it's also oil companies. I don't know why I'm pointing in that direction, but that should tell you something. And there's also the international context. I think if we collect amounts, it's important to invest them to improve our technology because these taxes aren't there to make money. They're there to improve our environmental performance. The Honourable Member for Beauce. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I thank my colleague for his speech, full of energy as usual. I have seen him do so at the Agriculture Committee. I'm just thinking of what happened with the meeting with the 5 big grocery stores, and the committee produced a report on that. The Minister for Science and Technology thought it was worthwhile to invite them back, and he got the same answers again. And last Monday, Mr. Laflèche, the CEO of Metro, came by. I don't know if my colleague noticed when I asked the question if, in his opinion, the carbon tax, because my colleagues for Quebec say that it doesn't apply. Indirectly, it does apply. And when I asked the question as to whether or not it applied and whether the impact of the carbon tax had an impact everywhere in Canada and had a significant impact on the food sector, he said yes. So I'm wondering if my colleague took note of Mr. Laflèche's answer. The honourable member for Berthier-Masquinongé. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'll start by saying that I'm very pleased that my colleague from Beauce responded to the call that I sent out to him during my speech, and I appreciate it. I want to explain something. In Quebec, we have the same system as that used in California to manage our carbon. That's $471 million in costs, but agricultural corporations in Quebec are exempt from having to buy carbon credits. But that is part of our cap-and-trade system, and it will continue even if the rest of Canada is heading towards a carbon tax. One thing I don't understand, we can't have a 5-minute Q&A, but how is it that my colleague is talking about wanting to pull out the tax on Canada rather than defending Quebec? Why not extend the reimbursement for small businesses? There's so many small businesses in Beauce. I'm sure he's hearing my message. Could we give them some oxygen and some liquidity? That's just one example among many.
Member for Cowichan, Langford, Malahat Langford.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my fellow colleague of the Agriculture Committee for his great speech. I do enjoy working with him. He will be familiar from the multiple times that we've heard from grocery executives that they're often talking about how they work in a low-margin industry. And I think that is a slightly misleading argument that they present. I mean, first of all, Madam Speaker, it should be pointed out that in the last 3 years their margins have doubled. But if you look at it today, yes, when they're operating between 3 and a 3.5% margin, it may look small, but what people have to realize is that when their gross revenues continue to climb, even though that margin may seem static, of course their profits will continue to rise as a result. And I'm just wondering if my colleague can add a little bit more to that, because I have noticed a little bit of defensiveness from the grocery CEOs, and I think not enough attention is paid to the fact that we do just have 5 companies controlling 80% of the market. And perhaps he has some ideas on how we can try to turn that number around so that there is a little bit more flexibility and competition there. Thank you.
L'honorable député de Berthier-Masquinongé.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I appreciate my colleague from the NDP. We work together very well at the Agriculture Committee. Earlier in my speech, I talked about how it's ironic what we're going through now. People come and tell us, oh no, we're not taking more money than before. We've got a 2% margin, and then we look at the numbers and we see that they have gone up exponentially. And as I was saying earlier, some will say, well, it comes from the pharmacy part of our business. But what is the increased percentage of profit on their pharmaceutical side? When we do studies at committee, we take it seriously. We invite all the players in the network, unlike the minister who didn't invite everyone. He just invited a few big companies and some CEOs. He didn't bring agricultural producers or other representatives from the agri-food sector. That's one thing to note. So when we invite witnesses, we see that there's a significant imbalance when it comes to negotiating. For a small producer is being told by a large grocery chain, well, look, bring down your price or I'm not buying from you anymore. If it's a perishable project, they have their hands tied. I think as a state, it is our duty to investigate and find out what's going on. And that's what we did in the committee report. We had some observations on price setting and what's going on there, and looked into ways of regulating the relationships between the different players. But indeed, when it comes to large profits, we really need to shed light on that. Capitalism is a system that works, but it works with regulation. We don't want savage capitalism. We seem to be heading in that direction, and I don't think that's what we want.
Questions or comments? The Honourable Member for Souris-Mousmak.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate that. I want to thank the member for Bertie Masconange, and I hope I pronounced it correctly, for his comments. And, you know, throughout this speech, I mean, or the conversation, you know, we've taken a look at our farmers and the huge operating cost increases that we've seen. You know, they've increased 21.2% just in 2022 alone, which is a huge increase, and that cost gets filtered down and onto people. And I suspect the member, and I'd be interested to hear from him on, I've heard from many in my farming community, and particularly now at Christmas time, where we're sitting here at Christmas time and families are creating Christmas goodies for their families. And over the years, we've seen where they used to put butter in their Christmas goodies are now using margarine. And now we're finding out the price, and part of that was the cost. Part of it was also for respect for possible issues on the product, but ultimately the costs have continued. And now we see with margarine, which a lot of it was built with canola oil, the prices of that have increased. And I've just talked with a constituent just yesterday on that aspect of that increased cost. So I'm interested to know how he sees where that cost continually gets increased. We move from different products, and the product that's being produced to our consumers is being belittled and small, such that it's huge impact on Canadians and the huge taxes that are being put upon them.
Honorable député de Berthier-Maskinauger.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much to my colleague for the question. It's an interesting one. It's like what I was saying earlier. We need to look into the way we support our farmers. We need better insurance programs. Those programs were designed 20, 25 years ago for a context where there was one bad year out of 6, maybe 1 out of 7. Now, we've seen 3 bad years out of 3, and we don't know what next year is going to be like. The people from Abitibi talked about drought and fires. There's so many things we can no longer protect. We have to help them. And just one little statistic before I wrap it up. In Quebec, 44% of our farmers are working elsewhere because there's not enough income coming from their farm, and that's not okay.
The Honourable Member for Cowichan-Malahat-Langford will have 6 minutes.
6 minutes? Okay,
6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Hopefully
I'll try to do what I can. I'm happy to be standing up today to speak to this, but there is a little part of me which is also going to express some disappointment. I'm always in favor of being able to discuss the great work that happens at the Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food, but it does need to be said, Madam Speaker, that today we were supposed to be debating Bill C-58, which I think is quite an important landmark piece of legislation, something that my party proudly supports. And, you know, that bill is designed, of course, to make sure that, you know, collective bargaining is not going to be
I'm just giving everybody a heads up that I'm shutting down the stream at 6 o'clock, so that is in 7 minutes.
Today, but the Conservatives are the ones who decided to move a concurrence debate on yet another committee report. And I think when you look at the Conservatives' history with labor relations, I think I can understand why they don't want to speak about Bill C-58, because, you know, when they were in government under Prime Minister Stephen Harper, they were not afraid to use back-to-work legislation. And indeed, when 2 Conservative members started speaking on Bill C-58 at second reading, they didn't touch on the substance of the bill, because I don't think they've got anything to contribute, and I don't even know if they actually support the bill. So for a party that is trying to rebrand itself as a party of workers, to not want to debate a bill that is protecting organized labor, protecting the collective bargaining rights of workers, well, I'll let Canadians make their own judgment on what that's all about. But turning to the report that we're discussing today, Madam Speaker, the Grocery Affordability report from the Agriculture Committee, I'm proud to say that this report issued from a motion that I brought at committee. I want to thank all members of that committee for granting a unanimous vote, because I think they were feeling the political and public pressure of the moment from Canadians coast to coast to coast, who have been feeling the pinch over the last 2 years on the spiraling out of control grocery prices, which we know have been going up higher and faster than the general rate of inflation. And, you know, as a part of this, Madam Speaker, we've had the opportunity to question the grocery CEOs. We had them as a part of the original study, which we're doing now. The Agriculture Committee is now revisiting this issue, and we've had a chance to quote-unquote re-interview the CEOs. And you know what strikes me, Madam Speaker, when you talk to the grocery executives, whether it's Michael Medline, whether it's Mr. Weston of Loblaw.
Can I interrupt the honourable member 2 seconds? There's a lot. Il y a beaucoup de bruit dans Merci.
There's a lot of noise. Thank you.
Member for Couchin.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As I was saying, when we were interviewing or questioning the witnesses, whether it's Michael Medline or Galen Weston of Loblaw, it becomes quite clear that these CEOs occupy a different universe from everyday people. They breathe a rarefied air. They command very impressive salaries. Galen Weston's example, I think his take-home pay is about 431 times that of his workers. And I think, they are quite defensive. They'll say, well, look, our margins are pretty small if you compare them to other industries. If you look at the data, actually, their margins have doubled over the last 3 years. And here's the thing, Madam Speaker, because their gross revenues have been going up. So even if margins remain static, as they have been for a little while now, those are still going to result in record profits, and you can see that when you compare quarterly earnings from one year to the next. And I think why this is such an emotional issue for Canadians, and I thank you for the 2-minute warning, Madam Speaker, it's because the products they are selling are essential for life. These aren't just any products like going to a hardware store. This is food. This is food. This is what people need to bring home to keep their families alive. And that is why it is such an emotional issue. And I know they also sell pharmaceutical products, also essential products. And I think why you're seeing that anger in the Canadian public is because for 2 to 3 years now, families in my riding and families right across this country have been having to make do with less. They've been having to make hard choices, and they are the ones who are bearing the burden, all the while corporate profits are reaching record levels. So there is an imbalance in Canada right now, where we have a country where corporate profits are reaching record levels, but everyone else is suffering. And I'm sorry to say, but I don't see enough action coming out of the present Liberal government, and we know where the Conservatives stand with their corporate friends. I mean, this is a party, when you present them with evidence showing oil and gas profits and their gargantuan effect on food prices, they'll just keep on going carbon tax, carbon tax, carbon tax, when it is minuscule compared to what corporate profits are doing in this sector. They don't want to argue with facts, that's fine. They want to live in a different reality. But I understand, Madam Speaker, I am in my last minute. I just want to say that I am proud to be a member of a party that drove this issue into committee. I'm proud that it's being discussed in the House. I'll conclude by saying that I will not stop fighting for the ordinary people in my riding and making sure that we expose corporate profits and their role in driving inflation in Canada.
The honourable member will have 14 minutes to pursue this when the motion back comes. It is my duty to interrupt the proceedings on the motion at this time. Conformément à l'article 66(1) du règlement.
Pursuant to the relevant standing order, debate on the motion is transferred to government business.
The House will now proceed to the consideration of private members' business as listed on today's order paper. Resuming debate. Orders of the day.
Private members' business, Bill C-290, standing in the name of Mr. Garon.
Where's my list?
Public Sector Integrity Act, third reading, resuming debate.
Mr. Garrett.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much. Thank you to my fans on the other end of the room. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It's an honor to rise today to speak briefly. I won't take up a lot of time, but on Bill C-290. This is an important piece of legislation, Madam Speaker, that amends the Public Servants Disclosure Protection Act, which gives the federal public sector employees and others to secure to a secure and confidential process for disclosing serious wrongdoing in the workplace, as well as protection from acts and reprisal. It proposes to expand the protections of the PSDPA to additional categories of public servants, permit that protected disclosure be made to any superior, and add a duty to provide support to whistleblowers, as well as repeal sections of the Act that prevent overlap with other recourse mechanisms and provisions that set the standards of seriousness of wrongdoing. The bill, Madam Speaker, is in line with some of the recommendations.
All right, everybody, I am shutting down the channel. I will be live again for the House of Commons tomorrow, so if you come back, like and subscribe, and that way you'll be notified when I go live. Have a good night.
Whistleblowing in the public sector. As I indicated, Madam Speaker, this is a bill that the government is very glad to see. It's a bill that the government is supportive of. We, as the government, believe that public servants who disclose serious wrongdoings must be protected. The public servants' disclosure